This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Creation Story and Science, a general article in the one-volume Bible Commentary, first edition January 1909, edited by the Reverend J. R. Dumelow, M.A. Many of the difficulties felt in connection with the Bible's story of creation arise from a misunderstanding of the bearing of modern science upon it. A few general considerations, therefore, may help to obviate them. A. There is a vague idea in many minds that science demands a much greater antiquity for the world than the Bible account will allow. This impression has probably been gathered from the statement in the margin of many Bibles that creation took place in the year 4004 BC. It is well, therefore, to be reminded that this marginal note is not a part of the Bible. It originated in calculations, both Jewish and Christian, which are now admitted to have been based upon imperfect knowledge. The sacred writer in Genesis does not commit himself to any definite limits of time, but simply speaks of the creation as taking place in the beginning, and this phrase is elastic enough to cover the modern scientific position. B. Another difficulty is caused by the apparent antagonism between modern scientific theories and the statement of Genesis 1 that the work of creation was completed in 6 days. Attempts have been made, from several points of view, to get rid of this antagonism by taking the language of the Scripture in a figurative sense. For example, it has been suggested by some that the sublime panorama of creation was flashed into some primeval prophet's consciousness in a series of visions that occupied a space of 6 days, and by others that the days are not to be interpreted as natural days of 24 hours each, but as age-long periods of time corresponding to the successive stages in the evolution of the world. Whatever truth there may be in these suggestions, and however helpful they may be to many minds, others may be able to obtain a more satisfactory rendering of the Bible account of creation by looking at it in the light of the 3 following considerations. 1. The story was written in the very childhood of our race, when human knowledge was only at the dawn, and men's minds were awakening for the first time to the problems of life and the world. It was inevitable, therefore, that it should be cast in a simple and childlike form, if it was to be at all intelligible to those among whom it appeared, and the wisdom of giving it such a setting has been more than justified by the impression it has left, and still continues to make, upon the thought of the world. 2. It is now widely admitted that the Genesis account of creation contains elements of belief which existed, perhaps thousands of years before the book of Genesis was written, among the peoples of Babylonia and Assyria. The connection between the traditions of these early nations and the story of Genesis is still a matter of discussion, but one thing has emerged clearly from their comparison. Whatever elements the sacred writer in Genesis may have in common with the Babylonian and Assyrian beliefs, he has been able to redeem and purify them from their baser form, and invest them with the presence and power of a sovereign God, the one only creator of heaven and earth. 3. The purpose of the writer in Genesis 1 is not scientific, but religious. His scientific knowledge may be bounded by the horizon of the age in which he lived, but the religious truths he teaches are irrefutable and eternal. To put the matter in another way, the scientific account of creation has been written by the finger of God upon the crust of the earth, and men are slowly spelling it out. But the religious account of creation is written in the first chapter of Genesis, in letters that all can read. Both accounts are from God, and should be received accordingly. As Dr. Marcus Dobbs has said, the greatest mistake is made when men seek in the one record what can only be found in the other, when they either refuse to listen to the affirmations of nature because they seem to disagree with what is found in the Bible, or when they are content with the teaching of nature as if nature could tell us all we need to know about ourselves, about the world, and about God. What was necessary in the primitive world to save men from grovelling, debasing polytheism was the knowledge that it was God, holy and good, who made all things, and that the crown and summit of his work was man. And this is the knowledge set forth in the book of Genesis. The real question for us is then, does the story of Genesis so accomplish what seems to be its purpose that only inspiration from God can account for it? To ask, is it a completely scientific account of creation, is to raise an issue that is scarcely fair. C. These considerations must be kept in mind, for they are equally helpful, in dealing with the further difficulty that has arisen in connection with the theory of evolution and the marvelous discoveries with which it has been associated. Science is now teaching that the order and beauty of the world are not the result of one directly creative act, but the outcome of a long and gradual process, continued probably over myriads of years, and that the varied life of nature is not as it was fixed in the beginning, but as it has been evolved through age-long periods and many lower stages from original germs. On the face of it, this teaching seems to conflict with the teaching of the Bible, and in particular to throw suspicion upon the story of creation as given in Genesis. It was thus it was received at first, but in recent years, as men have gone back to the old creation story and pondered it afresh, in view of the teaching of science, their difficulties and perplexities have largely disappeared. Besides making allowances for the considerations already urged under B, they have come to see that creation would be just as divine and miraculous if it was slow and gradual, as it would be if it were sudden and complete. The power necessary to originate and support a ceaseless and prolonged process of development in the world would be no less than that required to bring it into being in a moment and sustain it in its ordered course. Doubtless, God could instantaneously make a mighty oak, but it is no less wonderful that he should make it gradually, causing it to grow out of the little acorn, of which we can carry a dozen in the hand, yet every one of which contains within it a germ endued with the power to carry on a succession of mighty oaks through ages to come. To realize this is to advance a long way in the solution of the difficulty arising from the theory of evolution, and rob it of its power to disturb a genuine faith in the Bible. A further reflection, however, may be called in to support the mind of the biblical believer. Not only is evolution itself only a theory, which may in the future undergo modification, and may possibly be displaced by some other theory, but even if it is a true and final account of the origin of created things, the old creation story of Genesis is, to say the least, not incompatible with it. The process of creation, as unfolded in Genesis, when viewed in the light of the new scientific teaching, reveals a law of continuous development, which is at least a foreshadowing of the process of evolution. And so the apparent irreconcilability between them becomes largely reduced, if it does not indeed altogether disappear. These, we read, are the generations of the heavens when they were created. The inspired historian saw no almighty hand building up the galleries of creation. He heard no sound of hammer nor confused noise of workmen. The Spirit of the Lord moved upon the face of the deep. Chaos took form and comeliness before his inspired vision, and the solar system grew through a succession of days to its present order and beauty. At last, when all things were ready, after how many myriads of years we know not, man came forth, the summit of the whole creation, for God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul. End of the creation story and science. Recorded by Tim Mackenzie.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. God and the State by Mikhail Bakunin. Chapter 1. Who is right, the idealists or the materialists? The question once stated in this way, hesitation becomes impossible. Undoubtedly, the idealists are wrong and the materialists right. Yes, facts are before ideas. Yes, the ideal, as Proudhon said, is but a flower, whose root lies in the material conditions of existence. Yes, the whole history of humanity, intellectual and moral, political and social, is but a reflection of its economic history. All branches of modern science, of true and disinterested science, concur in proclaiming this grand truth, fundamental and decisive. The social world, properly speaking, the human world, in short, humanity, is nothing other than the last and supreme development, at least on our planet, and as far as we know, the highest manifestation of animality. But as every development necessarily implies a negation, that of its base or point of departure, humanity is at the same time and essentially the deliberate and gradual negation of the animal element in man. And it is precisely this negation, as rational as it is natural, and rational only because natural, at once historical and logical, as inevitable as the development and realization of all the natural laws in the world, that constitutes and creates the ideal, the world of intellectual and moral convictions, ideas. Yes, our first ancestors, our Adams and our Eves, were, if not gorillas, very near relatives of gorillas, omnivorous, intelligent and ferocious beasts, endowed in a higher degree than the animals of other species with two precious faculties, the power to think and the desire to rebel. These faculties, combining their progressive action in history, represent the essential factor, the negative power in the positive development of human animality, and create consequently all that constitutes humanity in man. The Bible, which is a very interesting and here and there very profound book, when considered as one of the oldest surviving manifestations of human wisdom and fancy, expresses this truth very naively in its myth of original sin. Jehovah, who of all the good gods adored by men was certainly the most jealous, the most vain, the most ferocious, the most unjust, the most bloodthirsty, the most despotic, and the most hostile to human dignity and liberty, Jehovah had just created Adam and Eve to satisfy we know not what caprice, no doubt to while away his time, which must weigh heavy on his hands in his eternal egoistic solitude, or that he might have some new slaves. He generously placed at their disposal the whole earth, with all its fruits and animals, and set but a single limit to this complete enjoyment. He expressly forbade them from touching the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He wished, therefore, that man, destitute of all understanding of himself, should remain an eternal beast, ever on all fours before the eternal God, his Creator and his Master. But here steps in Satan, the eternal rebel, the first freethinker and the emancipator of worlds. He makes man ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience. He emancipates him, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity, in urging him to disobey and eat of the fruit of knowledge. We know what followed. The good God, whose foresight, which is one of the divine faculties, should have warned him of what would happen, flew into a terrible and ridiculous rage. He cursed Satan, man, and the world created by himself, striking himself, so to speak, in his own creation, as children do when they get angry. And not content with smiting our ancestors themselves, he cursed them in all the generations to come, innocent of the crime committed by their forefathers. Our Catholic and Protestant theologians look upon that as very profound and very just, precisely because it is monstrously iniquitous and absurd. Then, remembering that he was not only a God of vengeance and wrath, but also a God of love, after having tormented the existence of a few milliards of poor human beings and condemned them to an eternal hell, he took pity on the rest, and to save them and reconcile his eternal and divine love with his eternal and divine anger, always greedy for victims and blood, he sent into the world as an expiatory victim his only Son, that he might be killed by men. That is called the mystery of the redemption, the basis of all the Christian religions. Still, if the divine Saviour had saved the human world, but no. In the paradise promised by Christ, as we know, such being the formal announcement, the elect will number very few. The rest, the immense majority of the generations present and to come, will burn eternally in hell. In the meantime, to console us, God, ever just, ever good, hands over the earth to the government of the Napoleon III's, of the William I's, of the Ferdinands of Austria, and of the Alexanders of all the Russias. Such are the absurd tales that are told, and the monstrous doctrines that are taught in the full light of the 19th century in all the public schools of Europe, at the express command of the government. They call this civilizing the people. Is it not plain that all these governments are systematic poisoners, interested stupefiers of the masses? I have wandered from my subject, because anger gets hold of me whenever I think of the base and criminal means which they employ to keep the nations in perpetual slavery, undoubtedly that they may be the better able to fleece them. Of what consequence are the crimes of all the Tropmans in the world, compared with this crime of treason against humanity committed daily, in broad day, over the whole surface of the civilized world, by those who dare call themselves the guardians and fathers of the people? I return to the myth of original sin. God admitted that Satan was right. He recognized that the devil did not deceive Adam and Eve in promising them knowledge and liberty as a reward for the act of disobedience which he had induced them to commit. For, immediately they had eaten of the forbidden fruit, God himself said, see Bible, Behold, man is become as of the gods, knowing both good and evil. Prevent him, therefore, from eating of the fruit of eternal life, lest he become immortal like ourselves. Let us disregard now the fabulous portion of this myth and consider its true meaning, which is very clear. Man has emancipated himself. He has separated himself from animality and constituted himself a man. He has begun his distinctively human history and development by an act of disobedience and science, that is, by rebellion and by thought. Three elements, or, if you like, three fundamental principles, constitute the essential condition of all human development, collective or individual, in history. 1. Human animality. 2. Thought. And 3. Rebellion. To the first properly corresponds social and private economy, to the second science, to the third liberty. Idealists of all schools, aristocrats and bourgeois, theologians and metaphysicians, politicians and moralists, religionists, philosophers or poets, not forgetting the liberal economists, unbounded worshippers of the ideal, as we know, are much offended when told that man, with his magnificent intelligence, his sublime ideas and his boundless aspirations, is, like all else existing in the world, nothing but matter, only a product of vile matter. We may answer that the matter of which materialists speak, matter spontaneously and eternally mobile, active, productive, matter chemically or organically determined and manifested by the properties of forces, mechanical, physical, animal, and intelligent, which necessarily belong to it, that this matter has nothing in common with the vile matter of the idealists. The latter, a product of their false abstraction, is indeed a stupid, inanimate, immobile thing, incapable of giving birth to the smallest product, a caput mortuum, an ugly fancy, in contrast to the beautiful fancy which they call God. As the opposite of this supreme being, matter, their matter, stripped by that which constitutes its real nature, necessarily represents supreme nothingness. They have taken away intelligence, life, all its determining qualities, active relations or forces, motion itself, without which matter would not even have weight, leaving it nothing but impenetrability and absolute immobility in space. They have attributed all these natural forces, properties and manifestations to the imaginary being created by their abstract fancy. Then, interchanging roles, they have called this product of their imagination, this phantom, this God who is nothing, supreme being, and, as a necessary consequence, have declared that the real being, matter, the world, is nothing. After which they gravely tell us that this matter is incapable of producing anything, not even of setting itself in motion, and consequently must have been created by their God. At the end of this book I exposed the fallacies and truly revolting absurdities to which one is inevitably led by this imagination of a God. Let him be considered as a personal being, the creator and organizer of worlds, or even as impersonal, a kind of divine soul spread over the whole universe, and constituting thus its eternal principle. Or let him be an idea, infinite and divine, always present and active in the world, and always manifested by the totality of material and definite beings. Here I shall deal with one point only. The gradual development of the material world, as well as of organic animal life, and of the historically progressive intelligence of man, individually or socially, is perfectly conceivable. It is a wholly natural movement from the simple to the complex, from the lower to the higher, from the inferior to the superior, a movement in conformity with all our daily experiences, and consequently in conformity also with our natural logic, with the distinctive laws of our mind, which, being formed and developed only by the aid of these same experiences, is, so to speak, but the mental, cerebral reproduction or reflected summary thereof. The system of the idealists is quite the contrary of this. It is the reversal of all human experiences, and of that universal and common good sense which is the essential condition of all human understanding, and which, in rising from the simple and unanimously recognized truth that twice two are four, to the sublimest and most complex scientific considerations, admitting, moreover, nothing that has not stood the severest tests of experience or observation of things and facts, becomes the only serious basis of human knowledge. Very far from pursuing the natural order from the lower to the higher, from the inferior to the superior, and from the relatively simple to the more complex, instead of wisely and rationally accompanying the progressive and real movement from the world called inorganic to the world organic, vegetable, animal, and then distinctively human, from chemical matter or chemical being to living matter or living being, and from living being to thinking being, the idealists, obsessed, blinded, and pushed on by the divine phantom which they have inherited from theology, take precisely the opposite course. They go from the higher to the lower, from the superior to the inferior, from the complex to the simple. They begin with God, either as a person or as a divine substance or idea, and the first step that they take is a terrible fall from the sublime heights of the eternal ideal into the mire of the material world, from absolute perfection into absolute imperfection, from thought to being, or rather, from supreme being to nothing. When, how, and why the divine being, eternal, infinite, absolutely perfect, probably weary of himself, decided upon this desperate salto mortale, is something which no idealist, no theologian, no metaphysician, no poet has ever been able to understand himself or explain to the profane. All religions, past and present, and all the systems of transcendental philosophy hinge on this unique, iniquitous mystery. Footnote. I call it iniquitous because, as I believe I have proved in the appendix alluded to, This mystery has been and still continues to be the consecration of all the horrors which have been and are being committed in the world. I call it unique because all other theological and metaphysical absurdities which debase the human mind are but its necessary consequences. End footnote. Holy men, inspired lawgivers, prophets, messiahs, have searched it for life and found only torment and death. Like the ancient Sphinx, it has devoured them, because they could not explain it. Great philosophers, from Heraclitus and Plato down to Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel, not to mention the Indian philosophers, have written heaps of volumes and built systems as ingenious as sublime, in which they have said by the way many beautiful and grand things and discovered immortal truths, but they have left this mystery, the principal object of their transcendental investigations, as unfathomable as before. The gigantic efforts of the most wonderful geniuses that the world has known, and who, one after another for at least 30 centuries, have undertaken anew this labour of Sisyphus, have resulted only in rendering this mystery still more incomprehensible. Is it to be hoped that it will be unveiled to us by the routine speculations of some pedantic disciple of an artificially warmed-over metaphysics at a time when all living and serious spirits have abandoned that ambiguous science born of a compromise, historically explicable no doubt, between the unreason of faith and sound scientific reason? It is evident that this terrible mystery is inexplicable, that is, absurd, because only the absurd admits of no explanation. It is evident that whoever finds it essential to his happiness and life must renounce his reason and return, if he can, to naive, blind, stupid faith, to repeat with Tertullianus and all sincere believers these words which sum up the very quintessence of theology. Credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. Then all discussion ceases, and nothing remains but the triumphant stupidity of faith. But immediately there arises another question. How comes an intelligent and well-informed man ever to feel the need of believing in this mystery? Nothing is more natural than that the belief in God, the Creator, Regulator, Judge, Master, Cursor, Saviour and Benefactor of the world, should still prevail among the people, especially in the rural districts, where it is more widespread than amongst the proletariat of the cities. The people, unfortunately, are still very ignorant, and are kept in ignorance by the systematic efforts of all the governments, who consider this ignorance, not without good reason, as one of the essential conditions of their own power. Weighted down by their daily labour, deprived of leisure, of intellectual intercourse, of reading, in short, of all the means and a good portion of the stimulants that develop thought in men, the people generally accept religious traditions without criticism, and in a lump. These traditions surround them from infancy in all the situations of life, and artificially sustained in their minds by a multitude of official poisoners of all sorts, priests and laymen, are transformed therein into a sort of mental and moral Babbitt, too often more powerful even than their natural good sense. There is another reason which explains and in some sort justifies the absurd beliefs of the people, namely the wretched situation in which they find themselves fatally condemned by the economic organisation of society in the most civilised countries of Europe. Reduced intellectually and morally as well as materially to the minimum of human existence, confined in their life like a prisoner in his prison, without horizon, without outlet, without even a future if we believe the economists, the people would have the singularly narrow souls and blunted instincts of the bourgeois if they did not feel a desire to escape. But of escape there are but 3 methods, 2 chimerical and a 3rd real. The first 2 are the dram shop and the church, debauchery of the body or debauchery of the mind. The 3rd is social revolution. Hence I conclude that this last will be much more potent than all the theological propagandism of the freethinkers to destroy to the last vestige the religious beliefs and dissolute habits of the people, beliefs and habits much more intimately connected than is generally supposed. In substituting for the at once illusory and brutal enjoyments of bodily and spiritual licentiousness, the enjoyments as refined as they are real, of humanity developed in each and all, the social revolution alone will have the power to close at the same time all the dram shops and all the churches. Till then the people, taken as a whole, will believe, and if they have no reason to believe, they will have at least a right. There is a class of people who, if they do not believe, must at least make a semblance of believing. This class, comprising all the tormentors, all the oppressors, and all the exploiters of humanity, priests, monarchs, statesmen, soldiers, public and private financiers, officials of all sorts, policemen, gendarmes, jailers and executioners, monopolists, capitalists, tax leeches, contractors and landlords, lawyers, economists, politicians of all shades, down to the smallest vendor of sweetmeats, all will repeat in unison those words of Voltaire. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. For, you understand, the people must have a religion. That is the safety valve. There exists, finally, a somewhat numerous class of honest but timid souls who, too intelligent to take the Christian dogmas seriously, reject them in detail, but have neither the courage nor the strength nor the necessary resolution to summarily renounce them altogether. They abandon to your criticism all the special absurdities of religion. They turn up their noses at all the miracles, but they cling desperately to the principal absurdity, the source of all the others, to the miracle that explains and justifies all the other miracles, the existence of God. Their God is not the vigorous and powerful being, the brutally positive God of theology. It is a nebulous, diaphanous, illusory being that vanishes into nothing at the first attempt to grasp it. It is a mirage, an ignis fatuus, that neither warms nor illuminates, and yet they hold fast to it, and believe that, were it to disappear, all would disappear with it. They are uncertain, sickly souls, who have lost their reckoning in the present civilization, belonging to neither the present nor the future, pale phantoms eternally suspended between heaven and earth, and occupying exactly the same position between the politics of the bourgeois and the socialism of the proletariat. They have neither the power nor the wish nor the determination to follow out their thought, and they waste their time and pains in constantly endeavouring to reconcile the irreconcilable. In public life, these are known as bourgeois socialists. With them or against them, discussion is out of the question. They are too puny. But there are a few illustrious men of whom no one will dare to speak without respect, and whose vigorous health, strength of mind, and good intention no one will dream of calling in question. I need only cite the names of Mazzini, Michelet, Quinet, John Stuart Mill. Footnote: Mr. Stuart Mill is perhaps the only one whose serious idealism may be fairly doubted, and that for two reasons. First, that if not absolutely the disciple, he is a passionate admirer and adherent of the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte, a philosophy which, in spite of its numerous reservations, is really atheistic. Second, that Mr. Stuart Mill is English, and in England to proclaim oneself an atheist is to ostracize oneself, even at this late day. End footnote. Generous and strong souls, great hearts, great minds, great writers, and the first, the heroic and revolutionary regenerator of a great nation, they are all apostles of idealism, and bitter despisers and adversaries of materialism, and consequently of socialism also, in philosophy as well as in politics. Against them, then, we must discuss this question. First, let it be remarked that not one of the illustrious men I have just named, nor any other idealistic thinker of any consequence in our day, has given any attention to the logical side of this question, properly speaking. Not one has tried to settle philosophically the possibility of the divine salto mortale, from the pure and eternal regions of the spirit into the mire of the material world. Have they feared to approach this irreconcilable contradiction, and despaired of solving it after the failures of the greatest geniuses of history? Or have they looked upon it as already sufficiently well settled? That is their secret. The fact is that they have neglected the theoretical demonstration of the existence of a God, and have developed only its practical motives and consequences. They have treated it as a fact universally accepted and, as such, no longer susceptible of any doubt whatever, for sole proof thereof limiting themselves to the establishment of the antiquity and this very universality of the belief in God. This imposing unanimity, in the eyes of many illustrious men and writers, to quote only the most famous of them who eloquently expressed it, Joseph de Maistre, and the great Italian patriot Giuseppe Mazzini, is of more value than all the demonstrations of science, and if the reasoning of a small number of logical and even very powerful but isolated thinkers is against it, so much the worse, they say, for these thinkers and their logic. For their universal consent, the general and primitive adoption of an idea has always been considered the most triumphant testimony to its truth. The sentiment of the whole world, a conviction that is found and maintained always and everywhere, cannot be mistaken. It must have its root in a necessity absolutely inherent in the very nature of man. And since it has been established that all peoples, past and present, have believed and still believe in the existence of God, it is clear that those who have the misfortune to doubt it, whatever the logic that led them to this doubt, are abnormal exceptions, monsters. Thus, then, the antiquity and universality of a belief should be regarded, contrary to all science and all logic, as sufficient and unimpeachable proof of its truth. Why? Until the days of Copernicus and Galileo, everybody believed that the sun revolved about the earth. Was not everybody mistaken? What is more ancient and more universal than slavery? Cannibalism, perhaps. From the origin of historic society down to the present day, there has been always and everywhere exploitation of the compulsory labour of the masses, slaves, serfs, or wage workers by some dominant minority, oppression of the people by the church and by the state. Must it be concluded that this exploitation and this oppression are necessities absolutely inherent in the very existence of human society? These are examples which show that the argument of the champions of God proves nothing. Nothing, in fact, is as universal or as ancient as the iniquitous and absurd. Truth and justice, on the contrary, are the least universal, the youngest features in the development of human society. In this fact, too, lies the explanation of a constant historical phenomenon, namely, the persecution of which those who first proclaim the truth have been and continue to be the objects at the hands of the official, privileged and interested representatives of universal and ancient beliefs, and often also at the hands of the same masses who, after having tortured them, always end by adopting their ideas and rendering them victorious. To us materialists and revolutionary socialists, there is nothing astonishing or terrifying in this historical phenomenon. Strong in our conscience, in our love of truth at all hazards, in that passion for logic which of itself alone constitutes a great power and outside of which there is no thought, strong in our passion for justice, and in our unshakable faith in the triumph of humanity over all theoretical and practical bestialities, strong, finally, in the mutual confidence and support given each other by the few who share our convictions, we resign ourselves to all the consequences of this historical phenomenon, in which we see the manifestation of a social law as natural, as necessary, and as invariable as all the other laws which govern the world. This law is a logical, inevitable consequences of the animal origin of human society. For in face of all the scientific, physiological, psychological, and historical proofs accumulated at the present day, as well as in the face of the exploits of the Germans conquering France, which now furnish so striking a demonstration thereof, it is no longer possible to really doubt this origin. But from the moment that this animal origin of man is accepted, all is explained. History then appears to us as the revolutionary negation, now slow, apathetic, sluggish, now passionate and powerful, of the past. It consists precisely in the progressive negation of the primitive animality of man by the development of his humanity. Man, a wild beast, cousin of the gorilla, has emerged from the profound darkness of animal instinct into the light of the mind, which explains in a wholly natural way all his past mistakes, and partially consoles us for his present errors. He has gone out from animal slavery, and passing through divine slavery, a temporary condition between his animality and his humanity, he is now marching on to the conquest and realization of human liberty. Whence it results that the antiquity of a belief, of an idea, far from proving anything in its favour, ought, on the contrary, to lead us to suspect it. For behind us is our animality, and before us our humanity. Human light, the only thing that can warm and enlighten us, the only thing that can emancipate us, give us dignity, freedom and happiness, and realise fraternity among us, is never at the beginning, but, relatively to the epoch in which we live, always at the end of history. Let us then never look back, let us look ever forward, for forward is our sunlight, forward our salvation. If it is justifiable, and even useful and necessary, to turn back to study our past, it is only in order to establish what we have been and what we must no longer be, what we have believed and thought and what we must no longer believe or think, what we have done and what we must do nevermore. So much for antiquity. As for the universality of an error, it proves but one thing: the similarity, if not the perfect identity, of human nature in all ages and under all skies. And since it establishes that all peoples at all periods of their life have believed and still believe in God, we must simply conclude that the divine idea, an outcome of ourselves, is an error historically necessary in the development of humanity, and ask why and how it was produced in history, and why an immense majority of the human race still accept it as a truth. Until we shall account to ourselves for the manner in which the idea of a supernatural or divine world was developed and had to be developed in the historical evolution of the human conscience, all our scientific conviction of its absurdity will be in vain. Until then we shall never succeed in destroying it in the opinion of the majority, because we shall never be able to attack it in the very depths of the hut-man being where it had birth. Condemned to a fruitless struggle, without issue and without end, we should forever have to content ourselves with fighting it solely on the surface, in its innumerable manifestations whose absurdity will be scarcely beaten down by the blows of common sense before it will reappear in a new form no less nonsensical. While the root of all the absurdities that torment the world, belief in God, remains intact, it will never fail to bring forth new offspring. Thus, at the present time, in certain sections of the higher society, spiritualism tends to establish itself upon the ruins of Christianity. It is not only in the interest of the masses, it is in that of the health of our own minds, that we should strive to understand the historic genesis, the succession of causes which developed and produced the idea of God in the consciousness of men. In vain shall we call and believe ourselves atheists, until we comprehend these causes, for until then we shall always suffer ourselves to be more or less governed by the clamours of this universal conscience whose secret we have not discovered, and, considering the natural weakness of even the strongest individual against the all-powerful influence of the social surroundings that trammel him, we are always in danger of relapsing sooner or later, in one way or another, into the abyss of religious absurdity. Examples of these shameful conversions are frequent in society today. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 13 of Far from the Madding Crowd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 13. Sortus Sanctorum, the Valentine. It was Sunday afternoon in the farmhouse on the 13th of February. dinner being over, Bathsheba, for want of a better companion, had asked Liddy to come and sit with her. The mouldy pile was dreary in winter time before the candles were lighted and the shutters closed. The atmosphere of the place seemed as old as the walls. Every nook behind the furniture had a temperature of its own, for the fire was not kindled in this part of the house early in the day, and Bathsheba's new piano, which was an old one in other annals, looked particularly sloping and out of level on the warped floor before night threw a shade over its less prominent angles and hid the unpleasantness. Liddy, like a little brook, though shallow, was always rippling. Her presence had not so much weight as to task thought, and yet enough to exercise it. On the table lay an old quarto Bible, bound in leather. Liddy, looking at it, said, "Did you ever find out, miss, who you are going to marry by means of the Bible and key?" "Don't be so foolish, Liddy, as if such things could be." "Well, there's a good deal in it all the same." "Nonsense, child." "And it makes your heart beat fearful. Some believe in it, some don't. I do." "Very well, let's try it," said Bathsheba, bounding from her seat with that total disregard of consistency which can be indulged in towards a dependent, and entering into the spirit of divination at once. "Go and get the front door key." Liddy fetched it. "I wish it wasn't Sunday," she said on returning. "Perhaps 'tis wrong." "What's right weekdays is right Sundays," replied her mistress in a tone which was a proof in itself. The book was opened. The leaves, drab with age, being quite worn away at much-read verses by the forefingers of unpractised readers in former days, where they were moved along under the line as an aid to the vision. The special verse in the book of Ruth was sought out by Bathsheba, and the sublime words met her eye. They slightly thrilled and abashed her. It was wisdom in the abstract facing folly in the concrete. Folly in the concrete blushed, persisted in her intention, and placed the key on the book. A rusty patch immediately upon the verse, caused by previous pressure from an iron substance thereon, told that this was not the first time the old volume had been used for the purpose. "Now keep steady and be silent," said Bathsheba. The verse was repeated, the book turned round. Bathsheba blushed guiltily. "Who did you try?" said Liddy curiously. "I shall not tell you." "Did you notice Mr. Boldwood's doings in church this morning, miss?" Liddy continued, adumbrating by the remark the track her thoughts had taken. "No, indeed," said Bathsheba, with serene indifference. "His pew is exactly opposite yours, miss." "I know it." "And you did not see his goings-on?" "Certainly I did not, I tell you." Liddy assumed a smaller physiognomy, and shut her lips decisively. This move was unexpected and proportionately disconcerting. "What did he do?" Bathsheba said, perforce. "Didn't turn his head to look at you once all the service." "Why should he?" again demanded her mistress, wearing a nettled look. "I didn't ask him to." "Oh, no. But everybody else was noticing you, and it was odd he didn't. There, 'tis like him. Rich and gentlemanly, what does he care?" Bathsheba dropped into a silence intended to express that she had opinions on the matter too abstruse for Liddy's comprehension, rather than that she had nothing to say. "Dear me, I had nearly forgotten the valentine I bought yesterday," she exclaimed at length. "Valentine? Who for, miss?" said Liddy. "Farmer Boldwood?" It was a single name among all possible wrong ones that just at this moment seemed to Bathsheba more pertinent than the right. "Well, no. It is only for little Teddy Coggan. I have promised him something, and this will be a pretty surprise for him. Liddy, you may as well bring me my desk, and I'll direct it at once." Bathsheba took from her desk a gorgeously illuminated and embossed design in post octavo, which had been bought on the previous market day at the chief stationer's in Casterbridge. In the centre was a small oval enclosure. This was left blank, that the sender might insert tender words more appropriate to the special occasion than any generalities by a printer could possibly be. "Here's a place for writing," said Bathsheba. "What shall I put?" "Something of this sort, I should think," returned Liddy promptly. "The rose is red, the violet blue, carnation sweet, and so are you." "Yes, that shall be it. It just suits itself to a chubby-faced child like him," said Bathsheba. She inserted the words in a small though legible handwriting, enclosed the sheet in an envelope, and dipped her pen for the direction. "What fun it would be to send it to the stupid old Boldwood, and how he would wonder," said the irrepressible Liddy, lifting her eyebrows and indulging in an awful mirth, on the verge of fear, as she thought of the moral and social magnitude of the man contemplated. Bathsheba paused to regard the idea at full length. Boldwoods had begun to be a troublesome image. A species of Daniel in her kingdom, who persisted in kneeling eastward when reason and common sense said that he might just as well follow suit with the rest, and afford her the official glance of admiration which cost nothing at all. She was far from being seriously concerned about his nonconformity. Still, it was faintly depressing that the most dignified and valuable man in the parish should withhold his eyes, and that a girl like Liddy should talk about it. So Liddy's idea was at first rather harassing than piquant. "No, I won't do that. He wouldn't see any humour in it." "He'd worry to death," said the persistent Liddy. "Really, I don't care particularly to send it to Teddy," remarked her mistress. "He's rather a naughty child sometimes." "Yes, that he is." "Let's toss as men do," said Bathsheba, idly. "Now then, head Boldwood, tail Teddy. No, we won't toss money on a Sunday. That would be tempting the devil indeed." "Toss this hymn book. There can't be no sinfulness in that, miss." "Very well. Open Boldwood, shut Teddy." "No, it's more likely to fall open. Open Teddy, shut Boldwood." The book went fluttering in the air and came down shut. Bathsheba, a small yawn upon her mouth, took the pen, and with offhand serenity directed the missive to Boldwood. "Now light a candle, Liddy. Which seal shall we use? Here's a unicorn's head. There's nothing in that. What's this? 2 doves? No. It ought to be something extraordinary, ought it not, Liddy? Here's one with a motto. I remember it is some funny one, but I can't read it. We'll try this, and if it doesn't do, we'll have another." A large red seal was duly affixed. Bathsheba looked closely at the hot wax to discover the words. "Capital!" she exclaimed, throwing down the letter frolicsomely. "'Twould upset the solemnity of a parson and clerk, too." Liddy looked at the words of the seal and read, "Marry me." The same evening the letter was sent, and was duly sorted in Casterbridge post office that night, to be returned to Weatherbury again in the morning. So very idly and unreflectingly was this deed done. Of love as a spectacle Bathsheba had a fair knowledge, but of love subjectively she knew nothing. End of chapter 13. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Section 6, The Marriage of Lit, of the Faith of Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zachary Brewster-Geisz. The Marriage of Lit by Jack London. When John Fox came into a country where whiskey freezes solid and may be used as a paperweight for a large part of the year, he came without the ideals and illusions that usually hamper the progress of more delicately nurtured adventurers. Born and reared on the frontier fringe of the United States, he took with him into Canada a primitive cast of mind, an elemental simplicity and grip on things, as it were, that ensured him immediate success in his new career. From a mere servant of the Hudson Bay Company, driving a paddle with the voyageurs and carrying goods on his back across the portages, he swiftly rose to a factorship and took charge of a trading post at Fort Angeles. Here, because of his elemental simplicity, he took to himself a native wife, and, by reason of the connubial bliss that followed, he escaped the unrest and vain longings that curse the days of more fastidious men, spoil their work, and conquer them in the end. He lived contentedly, was at single purposes with the business he was set there to do, and achieved a brilliant record in the service of the company. About this time his wife died, was claimed by her people, and buried with savage circumstance in a tin trunk in the top of a tree. 2 sons she had borne him, and when the company promoted him, he journeyed with them still deeper into the vastness of the Northwest Territory to a place called Sin Rock, where he took charge of a new post in a more important fur field. Here he spent several lonely and depressing months, eminently disgusted with the unprepossessing appearance of the Indian maidens, and greatly worried by his growing sons who stood in need of a mother's care. Then his eyes chanced upon Lit-Lit. Lit-Lit, well, she is Lit-Lit, was the fashion in which he despairingly described her to his chief clerk, Alexander McLean. McLean was too fresh from his Scottish upbringing, not dry behind the ears yet, John Fox put it, to take to the marriage customs of the country. Nevertheless, he was not averse to the factors imperiling his own immortal soul, and, especially feeling an ominous attraction himself for Lit-Lit, he was somberly content to clinch his own soul's safety by seeing her married to the factor. Nor is it to be wondered that McLean's austere Scotch soul stood in danger of being thawed in the sunshine of Lit-Lit's eyes. She was pretty and slender and willowy, without the massive face and temperamental stolidity of the average squaw. Lit-Lit, so called from her fashion, even as a child, of being fluttery, of darting about from place to place like a butterfly, of being inconsequent and merry, and of laughing as lightly as she darted and danced about. Lit-Lit was the daughter of Snettishane, a prominent chief in the tribe, by a half-breed mother, and to him the factor fared casually one summer day to open negotiations of marriage. He sat with the chief in the smoke of a mosquito smudge before his lodge, and together they talked about everything under the sun, or at least everything that in the Northland is under the sun, with the sole exception of marriage. John Fox had come particularly to talk of marriage. Snettishane knew it, and John Fox knew he knew it, wherefore the subject was religiously avoided. This is alleged to be Indian subtlety. In reality it is transparent simplicity. The hours slipped by, and Fox and Snettishane smoked interminable pipes, looking each other in the eyes with a guilelessness superbly histrionic. In the mid-afternoon, McLean and his brother clerk McTavish strolled past, innocently uninterested, on their way to the river. When they strolled back again an hour later, Fox and Snettishane had attained to a ceremonious discussion of the condition and quality of the gunpowder and bacon which the company was offering in trade. Meanwhile, Lit-Lit, divining the factor's errand, had crept in under the rear wall of the lodge, and through the front flap was peeping out at the two logomachists by the mosquito smudge. She was flushed and happy-eyed, proud that no less a man than the factor, who stood next to God in the Northland hierarchy, had singled her out, femininely curious to see at close range what manner of man he was. Sunglare on the ice, camp smoke, and weather beat had burned his face to a copper brown, so that her father was as fair as he, while she was fairer. She was remotely glad of this, and more immediately glad that he was large and strong, though his great black beard half frightened her, it was so strange. Being very young, she was unversed in the ways of men. 17 times she had seen the sun travel south and lose itself beyond the skyline, and 17 times she had seen it travel back again and ride the sky day and night till there was no night at all. And through these years she had been cherished jealously by Snettishane, who stood between her and all suitors, listening disdainfully to the young hunters as they bid for her hand, and turning them away as though she were beyond price. Snettishane was mercenary. Lit-Lit was to him an investment. She represented so much capital from which he expected to receive not a certain definite interest, but an incalculable interest. And having thus been reared in a manner as near to that of the nunnery as tribal conditions would permit, it was with a great and maidenly anxiety that she peeped out at the man who had surely come for her, at the husband who was to teach her all that was yet unlearned of life, at the masterful being whose word was to be her law, and who was to meet and bound her actions and comportment for the rest of her days. But, peeping through the front flap of the lodge, flushed and thrilling at the strange destiny reaching out for her, she grew disappointed as the day wore along, and the factor and her father still talked pompously of matters concerning other things and not pertaining to marriage things at all. As the sun sank lower and lower towards the north and midnight approached, the factor began making unmistakable preparations for departure. As he turned to stride away, Lit-Lit's heart sank, but it rose again as he halted, half turning on one heel. "Oh, by the way, Snettishane," he said, I want a squaw to wash for me and mend my clothes. Snettishane grunted and suggested Wanadani, who was an old woman and toothless. No, no, interposed the factor. What I want is a wife. I've been kind of thinking about it, and the thought just struck me that you might know of someone that would suit. Snettishane looked interested, whereupon the factor retraced his steps, casually and carelessly, to linger and discuss this new and incidental topic. Ketu? Suggested Snettishane. She has but one eye, objected the factor. Laska? Her knees can be wide apart when she stands upright. Kips, your biggest dog, can leap between her knees when she stands upright. Sanity? Went on the imperturbable Snettishane. But John Fox feigned anger, crying, What foolishness is this? Am I old that thou shouldst make me with old women? Am I toothless, lame of leg, blind of eye? Or am I poor, that no bright-eyed maiden may look with favour upon me? Behold, I am the factor, both rich and great, a power in the land whose speech makes men tremble and is obeyed. Snettishane was inwardly pleased, though his sphinx-like visage never relaxed. He was drawing the factor, and making him break ground. Being a creature so elemental as to have room for but one idea at a time, Snettishane could pursue that one idea a greater distance than could John Fox. For John Fox, elemental as he was still complex enough to entertain several glimmering ideas at a time, which debarred him from pursuing the one as single-heartedly or as far as did the chief. Snettishane calmly continued calling the roster of eligible maidens which, name by name as fast as uttered, were stamped ineligible by John Fox, with specified objections appended. Again he gave it up and started to return to the fort. Snettishane watched him go, making no effort to stop him, but seeing him, in the end, stop himself. Come to think of it, the factor remarked, we both of us forgot Lit-Lit. Now I wonder if she'll suit me. Snettishane met the suggestion with a mirthless face, behind the mask of which his soul grinned wide. It was a distinct victory. Had the factor gone but one step farther, perforce Snettishane would himself have mentioned the name of Lit-Lit, but the factor had not gone that one step farther. The chief was non-committal concerning Lit-Lit's suitability, till he drove the white man into taking the next step in order of procedure. Well, the factor meditated aloud, the only way to find out is to make a try of it. He raised his voice. So I will give for Lit-Lit 10 blankets and 3 pounds of tobacco, which is good tobacco. Snettishane replied with a gesture which seemed to say that all the blankets and tobacco in all the world could not compensate him for the loss of Lit-Lit and her manifold virtues. When pressed by the factor to set a price, he coolly placed it at 500 blankets, 10 guns, 50 pounds of tobacco, 20 scarlet cloths, 10 bottles of rum, a music box, and lastly the goodwill and best offices of the factor, with a place by his fire. The factor apparently suffered a stroke of apoplexy, which stroke was successful in reducing the blankets to 200 and in cutting out the place by the fire, an unheard-of condition in the marriages of white men with the daughters of the soil. In the end, after 3 hours more of chaffering, they came to an agreement. For Lit-Lit, Snettishane was to receive 100 blankets, 5 pounds of tobacco, 3 guns, and a bottle of rum, goodwill and best offices included, which, according to John Fox, was 10 blankets and a gun more than she was worth. And as he went home through the wee small hours, the 3 o'clock sun blazing in the due northeast, he was unpleasantly aware that Snettishane had bested him over the bargain. Snettishane, tired and victorious, sought his bed and discovered Lit-Lit before she could escape from the lodge. He grunted knowingly. Thou hast seen, thou hast heard, wherefore it be plain to thee thy father's very great wisdom and understanding. I have made for thee a great match. Heed my words, and walk in the way of my words. Go when I say go, come when I bid thee come, and we shall grow fat with the wealth of this big white man who is a fool according to his bigness. The next day no trading was done at the store. The factor opened whiskey before breakfast, to the delight of McLean and McTavish, gave his dogs double rations, and wore his best moccasins. Outside the fort, preparations were underway for a potlatch. Potlatch means a giving, and John Fox's intention was to signalize his marriage with Lit-Lit by a potlatch as generous as she was good-looking. In the afternoon the whole tribe gathered to the feast. Men, women, children, and dogs gorged to repletion, nor was there one person, even among the chance visitors and stray hunters from other tribes, who failed to receive some token of the bridegroom's largesse. Lit-Lit, tearfully shy and frightened, was bedecked by her bearded husband with a new calico dress, splendidly beaded moccasins, a gorgeous silk handkerchief over her raven hair, a purple scarf about her throat, brass earrings and finger rings, and a whole pint of pinchbeck jewelry, including a Waterbury watch. Snettishane could scarce contain himself at the spectacle, but watching his chance drew her aside from the feast. "Not this night, nor the next night," he began ponderously, "but in the nights to come, when I shall call like a raven by the river bank, it is for thee to rise up from thy big husband, who is a fool, and come to me. Nay, nay," he went on hastily, at sight of the dismay in her face at turning her back upon her wonderful new life. "For no sooner shall this happen than thy big husband, who is a fool, will come wailing to my lodge. Then it is for thee to wail likewise, claiming that this thing is not well, and that the other thing thou dost not like, and that to be the wife of the factor is more than thou didst bargain for, only wilt thou be content with more blankets and more tobacco and more wealth of various sorts for thy poor old father Snettishane. Remember well when I call in the night like a raven from the river bank." Lit-Lit nodded, for to disobey her father was a peril she knew well, and furthermore, it was a little thing he asked, a short separation from the factor, who would know only greater gladness at having her back. She returned to the feast, and, midnight being well at hand, the factor sought her out and led her away to the fort amid joking and outcry, in which the squaws were especially conspicuous. Lit-Lit quickly found that married life with the headman of a fort was even better than she had dreamed. No longer did she have to fetch wood and water and wait hand and foot upon cantankerous menfolk. For the first time in her life she could lie abed till breakfast was on the table. And what a bed! Clean and soft, and comfortable as no bed she had ever known. And such food! Flour cooked into biscuits, hot cakes and bread, 3 times a day and every day, and all one wanted. Such prodigality was hardly believable. To add to her contentment, the factor was cunningly kind. He had buried one wife, and he knew how to drive with a slack rein that went firm only on occasion, and then went very firm. "Lit-Lit is boss of this place," he announced significantly at the table the morning after the wedding. "What she says goes, understand?" And McLean and McTavish understood. Also, they knew that the factor had a heavy hand. But Lit-Lit did not take advantage. Taking a leaf from the book of her husband, she at once assumed charge of his own growing sons, giving them added comforts and a measure of freedom like to that which he gave her. The 2 sons were loud in the praise of their new mother. McLean and McTavish lifted their voices, and the factor bragged of the joys of matrimony till the story of her good behavior and her husband's satisfaction became the property of all the dwellers in the Sinrock district. Whereupon Snettishane, with visions of his incalculable interest keeping him awake of nights, thought it time to bestir himself. On the 10th night of her wedded life, Lit-Lit was awakened by the croaking of a raven, and she knew that Snettishane was waiting for her by the river bank. In her great happiness she had forgotten her pact, and now it came back to her with behind it all the childish terror of her father. For a time she lay in fear and trembling, loath to go, afraid to stay. But in the end the factor won the silent victory, and his kindness, plus his great muscles and square jaw, nerved her to disregard Snettishane's call. But in the morning she arose very much afraid, and went about her duties in momentary fear of her father's coming. As the day wore along, however, she began to recover her spirits. John Fox, soundly berating McLean and McTavish for some petty dereliction of duty, helped her to pluck up courage. She tried not to let him go out of her sight, and when she followed him into the huge cache and saw him twirling and tossing great bales around as though they were feather pillows, she felt strengthened in her disobedience to her father. Also, it was her first visit to the warehouse, and Sin Rock was the chief distributing point to several chains of lesser posts. She was astounded at the endlessness of the wealth there stored away. This sight and the picture in her mind's eye of the bare lods of Snettishane put all doubts at rest. Yet she capped her conviction by a brief word with one of her stepsons. "White daddy good?" was what she asked, and the boy answered that his father was the best man he had ever known. That night the raven croaked again. On the night following, the croaking was more persistent. It awoke the factor, who tossed restlessly for a while. Then he said aloud, "Damn that raven," and Lit-Lit laughed quietly under the blankets. In the morning, bright and early, Snettishane put in an ominous appearance, and was set to breakfast in the kitchen with Wanadani. He refused squaw food, and a little later bearded his son-in-law in the store where the trading was done. Having learned, he said, that his daughter was such a jewel, he had come for more blankets, more tobacco, and more guns, especially more guns. He had certainly been cheated in her price, he held, and he had come for justice. But the factor had neither blankets nor justice to spare. Whereupon he was informed that Snettishane had seen the missionary at Three Forks, who had notified him that such marriages were not made in heaven, and that it was his father's duty to demand his daughter back. "I am good Christian man now," Snettishane concluded. "I want my Lit-Lit to go to heaven." The factor's reply was short and to the point, for he directed his father-in-law to go to the heavenly antipodes, and by the scruff of the neck and the slack of the blanket propelled him on that trail as far as the door. But Snettishane sneaked around and in by the kitchen, cornering Lit-Lit in the great living room of the fort. "Mayhap thou didst sleep over sound last night when I called by the river bank," he began, glowering darkly. "Nay, I was awake and heard." Her heart was beating as though it would choke her, but she went on steadily. "And the night before I was awake and heard, and yet again the night before." And thereat, out of her great happiness, and out of the fear that it might be taken from her, she launched into an original and glowing address upon the status and rights of woman, the first New Woman lecture delivered north of 53. But it fell on unheeding ears. Snettishane was still in the Dark Ages. As she paused for breath, he said threateningly, "Tonight I shall call again like the raven." At this moment the factor entered the room and again helped Snettishane on his way to the heavenly antipodes. That night the raven croaked more persistently than ever. Lit-Lit, who was a light sleeper, heard and smiled. John Fox tossed restlessly. Then he awoke and tossed about with greater restlessness. He grumbled and snorted, swore under his breath and over his breath, and finally flung out of bed. He groped his way to the great living room, and from the rack took down a loaded shotgun, loaded with birdshot, left therein by the careless McTavish. The factor crept carefully out of the fort and down to the river. The croaking had ceased, but he stretched out in the long grass and waited. The air seemed a chilly balm, and the earth, after the heat of the day, now and again breathed soothingly against him. The factor, gathered into the rhythm of it all, dozed off, with his head upon his arm, and slept. 50 yards away, head resting on knees, and with his back to John Fox, Snettishane likewise slept, gently conquered by the quietude of the night. An hour slipped by, and then he awoke, and without lifting his head, set the night vibrating with the hoarse gutturals of the raven call. The factor roused, not with the abrupt start of civilized man, but with the swift and comprehensive glide from sleep to waking of the savage. In the nightlight he made out a dark object in the midst of the grass and brought his gun to bear upon it. A second croak began to rise, and he pulled the trigger. The crickets ceased from their sing-song chant, the wildfowl from their squabbling, and the raven croak broke midmost and died away in gasping silence. John Fox ran to the spot and reached for the thing he had killed, but his fingers closed on a coarse mop of hair, and he turned Snettishane's face upward to the starlight. He knew how a shotgun scattered at 50 yards, and he knew that he had peppered Snettishane across the shoulders and in the small of the back, and Snettishane knew that he knew, but neither referred to it. "What dost thou here?" the factor demanded. "It were time old Bones should be in bed." But Snettishane was stately in spite of the bird shot burning under his skin. "O old bones will not sleep," he said solemnly. "I weep for my daughter Lit, who liveth and who yet is dead, and who goeth without doubt to the white man's hell." "Weep henceforth on the far bank beyond earshot of the fort," said John Fox, turning on his heel, "for the noise of thy weeping is exceeding great, and will not let one sleep of nights." "My heart is sore," Snettishane answered, "and my days and nights be black with sorrow." "As the raven is black," said John Fox. "As the raven is black," Snettishane said. Never again was the voice of the raven heard by the riverbank. Lit grows matronly day by day and is very happy. Also, there are sisters to the sons of John Fox's first wife who lies buried in a tree. Old Snettishane is no longer a visitor at the fort, and spends long hours raising a thin, aged voice against the filial ingratitude of children in general, and of his daughter Lit in particular. His declining years are embittered by the knowledge that he was cheated, and even John Fox has withdrawn the assertion that the price for Lit was too much by 10 blankets and a gun. End of The Marriage of Lit. Recording by Zachary Brewster-Geisz, Greenbelt, Maryland, July 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 53. A Rescue and a Catastrophe. Friend Rawdon drove on then to Mr. Moss's mansion in Cursitor Street and was duly inducted into that dismal place of hospitality. Morning was breaking over the cheerful housetops of Chancery Lane as the rattling cab woke up the echoes there. A little pink-eyed boy with a head as ruddy as the rising morn let the party into the house, and Rawdon was welcomed to the ground-floor apartments by Mr. Moss, his travelling companion and host, who cheerfully asked him if he would like a glass of something warm after his drive. The colonel was not so depressed as some mortals would be, who, quitting a palace and a Plaquen's uxor, find themselves barred into a sponging-house. For if the truth must be told, he had been a lodger at Mr. Moss's establishment once or twice before. We have not thought it necessary, in the previous course of this narrative, to mention these trivial little domestic incidents, but the reader may be assured that they can't unfrequently occur in the life of a man who lives on nothing a year. Upon his first visit to Mr. Moss, the colonel, then a bachelor, had been liberated by the generosity of his aunt. On the second mishap, little Becky, with the greatest spirit and kindness, had borrowed a sum of money from Lord Southdown, and had coaxed her husband's creditor, who was her shawl, velvet gown, lace pocket handkerchief, trinket, and gimcrack purveyor, indeed, to take a portion of the sum claimed, and Rawdon's promissory note for the remainder. So on both these occasions the capture and release had been conducted with the utmost gallantry on all sides, and Moss and the colonel were therefore on the very best of terms. "You'll find your old bed, Colonel, and everything comfortable," that gentleman said. "As I may honestly say, you may be pretty sure it's kept aired, and by the best of company too. It was slep in the night afore last by the Honourable Captain Famish of the 50th Dragoons, whose ma took him out after a fortnight, just to punish him, she said. But Lord bless you, I promise you, he punished my champagne, and had a party here every night. Regular tip-top swells down from the clubs and the West End. Captain Ragg, the Honourable Deuceace, who lives in the Temple, and some fellers as knows a good glass of wine, I warrant you. I've got a Doctor of Divinity upstairs, 5 gents in the coffee-room, and Mrs. Moss has a table d'hote at 5:30, and a little cards or music afterwards, when we shall be most happy to see you." "I'll ring when I want anything," said Rawdon, and went quietly to his bedroom. He was an old soldier, we have said, and not to be disturbed by any little shocks of fate. A weaker man would have sent off a letter to his wife on the instant of his capture. "But what is the use of disturbing her night's rest?" thought Rawdon. "She won't know whether I'm in my room or not. It will be time enough to write to her when she has had her sleep out, and I have had mine. It's only 170, and the deuce is in it if we can't raise that." And so, thinking about little Rawdon, whom he would not have know that he was in such a queer place, the Colonel turned into the bed lately occupied by Captain Famish, and fell asleep. It was 10 o'clock when he woke up, and the ruddy-headed youth brought him with conscious pride a fine silver dressing-case wherewith he might perform the operation of shaving. Indeed, Mr. Moss's house, though somewhat dirty, was splendid throughout. There were dirty trays and wine-coolers en permanence on the sideboard, huge dirty gilt cornices with dingy yellow satin hangings to the barred windows which looked into Cursitor Street, vast and dirty gilt picture frames surrounding pieces, sporting and sacred, all of which works were by the greatest masters, and fetched the greatest prices too, in the bill transactions, in the course of which they were sold and bought over and over again. The Colonel's breakfast was served to him in the same dingy and gorgeous plated ware. Miss Moss, a dark-eyed maid in curl-papers, appeared with the teapot, and, smiling, asked the Colonel how he had slept, and she brought him in the Morning Post with the names of all the great people who had figured at Lord Steyne's entertainment the night before. It contained a brilliant account of the festivities, and of the beautiful and accomplished Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's admirable personifications. After a lively chat with this lady, who sat on the edge of the breakfast table in an easy attitude, displaying the drapery of her stocking, and an ex-white satin shoe which was down at heel, Colonel Crawley called for pens and ink and paper, and being asked how many sheets, chose one which was brought to him between Miss Moss's own finger and thumb. Many a sheet had that dark-eyed damsel brought in. Many a poor fellow had scrawled and blotted hurried lines of entreaty, and paced up and down that awful room until his messenger brought back the reply. Poor men always use messengers instead of the post. Who has not had their letters with the wafers wet and the announcement that a person is waiting in the hall? Now, on the score of his application, Rawdon had not many misgivings. "Dear Becky," Rawdon wrote, "I hope you slept well. Don't be frightened if I don't bring you in your coffee. Last night, as I was coming home smoking, I met with an accident. I was nabbed by Moss of Cursitor Street, from whose gilt and splendid parlour I write this, the same that had me this time 2 years. Miss Moss brought in my tea. She has grown very fat, and as usual had her stockings down at heel. It's Nathan's business, 150, with costs 170. Please send me my desk and some cloths. I'm in pumps and a white tie, something like Miss M's stockings. I've 70 in it, and as soon as you get this, drive to Nathan's, offer him 75 down, and ask him to renew. Say I'll take wine. We may as well have some dinner sherry, but not pictures. They're too dear. If he won't stand it, take my ticker and such of your things as you can spare, and send them to Ball's. We must, of course, have the sum tonight. It won't do to let it stand over, as tomorrow's Sunday. The beds here are not very clean, and there may be other things out against me. I'm glad it ain't Rawdon's Saturday for coming home. God bless you. Yours in haste, R.C. P.S. Make haste and come." This letter, sealed with a wafer, was dispatched by one of the messengers who were always hanging about Mr. Moss's establishment, and Rawdon, having seen him depart, went out in the courtyard and smoked his cigar with a tolerably easy mind, in spite of the bars overhead, for Mr. Moss's courtyard is railed in like a cage, lest the gentlemen who are boarding with him should take a fancy to escape from his hospitality. 3 hours, he calculated, would be the utmost time required before Becky should arrive and open his prison doors, and he passed these pretty cheerfully in smoking, in reading the paper, and in the coffee-room with an acquaintance, Captain Walker, who happened to be there, and with whom he cut for sixpences for some hours, with pretty equal luck on either side. But the day passed away, and no messenger returned, no Becky. Mr. Moss's table d'hôte was served at the appointed hour of 5:30, when such of the gentlemen lodging in the house as could afford to pay for the banquet came and partook of it in the splendid front parlour before described, and with which Mr. Crawley's temporary lodging communicated, when Miss Hem, as her papa called her, appeared without the curl papers of the morning, and Mrs. Hem did the honours of a prime boiled leg of mutton and turnips, of which the Colonel ate with a very faint appetite. Asked whether he would stand a bottle of champagne for the company, he consented, and the ladies drank to his health, and Mr. Moss, in the most polite manner, looked towards him. In the midst of this repast, however, the door-bell was heard. Young Moss, of the ruddy hair, rose up with the keys and answered the summons, and coming back, told the Colonel that the messenger had returned with a bag, a desk, and a letter, which he gave him. "No ceremony, Colonel, I beg," said Mrs. Moss, with a wave of her hand, and he opened the letter rather tremulously. It was a beautiful letter, highly scented, on a pink paper, and with a light green seal. "Mon pauvre cher petit," Mrs. Crawley wrote, "I could not sleep one wink for thinking of what had become of my odious old monstre, and only got to rest in the morning after sending for Mr. Blench, for I was in a fever, who gave me a composing draught and left orders with Finette that I should be disturbed on no account, so that my poor old man's messenger, who had bien mauvaise mine, Finette says, and sent toi le Genièvre, remained in the hall for some hours, waiting my bell. You may fancy my state when I read your poor dear old ill-spelled letter. Ill as I was, I instantly called for the carriage, and as soon as I was dressed, though I couldn't drink a drop of chocolate, I assure you I couldn't without my monstre to bring it to me, I drove ventre à terre to Nathan's. I saw him, I wept, I cried, I fell at his odious knees. Nothing would mollify the horrid man. He would have all the money, he said, or keep my poor monstre in prison. I drove home with the intention of paying that triste visite chez mon oncle, when every trinket I have should be at your disposal, though they would not fetch £100, for some, you know, are with ce cher oncle already, and found Milord there with the Bulgarian old sheep-faced monster, who had come to compliment me upon last night's performances. Paddington came in too, drawling and lisping and twiddling his hair. So did Champignac and his chef, everybody with foison of compliments and pretty speeches, plaguing poor me, who longed to be rid of them, and was thinking every moment of the time of mon pauvre prisonnier. When they were gone, I went down on my knees to Milord, told him we were going to pawn everything, and begged and prayed him to give me £200. He pished and pshawed in a fury, told me not to be such a fool as to pawn, and said he would see whether he could lend me the money. At last he went away, promising that he would send it me in the morning, when I will bring it to my poor old monster, with a kiss from his affectionate Becky. I am writing in bed. Oh, I have such a headache, and Such a heartache. When Rawdon read over this letter, he turned so red and looked so savage that the company at the table d'hôte easily perceived that bad news had reached him. All his suspicions, which he had been trying to banish, returned upon him. She could not even go out and sell her trinkets to free him. She could laugh and talk about compliments paid to her whilst he was in prison. Who had put him there? Wenham had walked with him. Was there... He could hardly bear to think of what he suspected. Leaving the room hurriedly, he ran into his own, opened his desk, wrote 2 hurried lines which he directed to Sir Pitt or Lady Crawley, and bade the messenger carry them at once to Gaunt Street, bidding him to take a cab and promising him a guinea if he was back in an hour. In the note he besought his dear brother and sister, for the sake of God, for the sake of his dear child and his honour, to come to him and relieve him from this difficulty. He was in prison, he wanted £100 to set him free. He entreated them to come to him. He went back to the dining room after dispatching his messenger and called for more wine. He laughed and talked with a strange boisterousness, as the people thought. Sometimes he laughed madly at his own fears and went on drinking for an hour, listening all the while for the carriage which was to bring his fate back. At the expiration of that time, wheels were heard whirling up to the gate. The young janitor went out with his gate keys. It was a lady whom he let in at the bailiff's door. "Colonel Crawley," she said, trembling very much. He, with a knowing look, locked the outer door upon her, then unlocked and opened the inner one, and calling out, "Colonel, you're wanted," led her into the back parlour, which he occupied. Rawdon came in from the dining parlour, where all those people were carousing, into his back room, a flare of coarse light following him into the apartment where the lady stood, still very nervous. "It is I, Rawdon," she said, in a timid voice which she strove to render cheerful. "It is Jane." Rawdon was quite overcome by that kind voice and presence. He ran up to her, caught her in his arms, gasped out some inarticulate words of thanks, and fairly sobbed on her shoulder. She did not know the cause of his emotion. The bills of Mr. Moss were quickly settled, perhaps to the disappointment of that gentleman, who had counted on having the Colonel as his guest over Sunday at least, and Jane, with beaming smiles and happiness in her eyes, carried away Rawdon from the bailiff's house, and they went homewards in the cab in which she had hastened to his release. "Pitt was gone to a parliamentary dinner," she said, when Rawdon's note came, "and so, dear Rawdon, I came myself." And she put her kind hand in his. Perhaps it was well for Rawdon Crawley that Pitt was away at that dinner. Rawdon thanked his sister 100 times, and with an ardour of gratitude which touched and almost alarmed that soft-hearted woman. "Oh," said he, in his rude, artless way, you don't know how I'm changed since I've known you and little Rawdy. I'd like to change somehow. You see, I want to be..." He did not finish the sentence, but she could interpret it. And that night after he left her, and as she sat by her own little boy's bed, she prayed humbly for that poor way-worn sinner. Rawdon left her and walked home rapidly. It was 9 o'clock at night. He ran across the streets and the great squares of Vanity Fair, and at length came up breathless opposite his own house. He started back and fell against the railings, trembling as he looked up. The drawing-room windows were blazing with light. She had said that she was in bed and ill. He stood there for some time, the light from the rooms on his pale face. He took out his door key and let himself into the house. He could hear laughter in the upper rooms. He was in the ball dress in which he had been captured the night before. He went silently up the stairs, leaning against the banisters at the stair head. Nobody was stirring in the house. Besides, all the servants had been sent away. Rawdon heard laughter within, laughter and singing. Becky was singing a snatch of the song of the night before. A hoarse voice shouted, "Brava! Brava!" It was Lord Steyne's. Rawdon opened the door and went in. A little table with a dinner was laid out, and wine and plate. Steyne was hanging over the sofa on which Becky sat. The wretched woman was in a brilliant, full toilette, her arms and all her fingers sparkling with bracelets and rings, and the brilliants on her breast which Steyne had given her. He had her hand in his, and was bowing over it to kiss it, when Becky started up with a faint scream, as she caught sight of Rawdon's white face. At the next instant she tried a smile, a horrid smile, as if to welcome her husband, and Steyne rose up, grinding his teeth, pale, and with fury in his looks. He too attempted a laugh, and came forward, holding out his hand. "What? Come back? How'd you do, Crawley?" he said, the nerves of his mouth twitching as he tried to grin at the intruder. There was that in Rawdon's face which caused Becky to fling herself before him. "I am innocent, Rawdon," she said. "Before God, I am innocent." She clung hold of his coat, of his hands. Her own were all covered with serpents and rings and baubles. "I am innocent. Say I am innocent," she said to Lord Steyne. He thought a trap had been laid for him, and was as furious with the wife as with the husband. "You innocent, damn you!" he screamed out. "You innocent? Why, every trinket you have on your body is paid for by me. I've given you thousands of pounds which this feller has spent, and for which he has sold you. Innocent? By God, you're as innocent as your mother, the ballet girl, and your husband, the bully. Don't think to frighten me as you've done others. Make way, sir, and let me pass." And Lord Steyne seized up his hat, and with flame in his eyes, and looking his enemy fiercely in the face, marched upon him, never for a moment doubting that the other would give way. But Rawdon Crawley, springing out, seized him by the neckcloth, until Steyne, almost strangled, writhed and bent under his arm. "You lie, you dog," said Rawdon. "You lie, you coward and villain." And he struck the peer twice over the face with his open hand, and flung him, bleeding, to the ground. It was all done before Rebecca could interpose. She stood there trembling before him. She admired her husband, strong, brave, and victorious. "Come here," he said. She came up at once. "Take off those things." She began, trembling, pulling the jewels from her arms and the rings from her shaking fingers, and held them all in a heap, quivering and looking up at him. "Throw them down," he said, and she dropped them. He tore the diamond ornament out of her breast and flung it at Lord Steyne. It cut him on his bald forehead. Steyne wore the scar to his dying day. "Come upstairs," Rawdon said to his wife. "Don't kill me, Rawdon," she said. He laughed savagely. "Ha! I want to see if that man lies about the money as he has about me. Has he given you any?" "No," said Rebecca. "That is—" "Give me your keys," Rawdon answered, and they went out together. Rebecca gave him all the keys but one, and she was in hopes that he would not have remarked the absence of that. It belonged to the little desk which Amelia had given her in early days, and which she kept in a secret place. But Rawdon flung open boxes and wardrobes, throwing the multifarious trumpery of their contents here and there, and at last he found the desk. The woman was forced to open it. It contained papers, love letters many years old, all sorts of small trinkets and women's memoranda. And it contained a pocketbook with banknotes. Some of these were dated 10 years back, too, and one was quite a fresh one. A note for £1,000, which Lord Steyne had given her. "Did he give you this?" Rawdon said. "Yes," Rebecca answered. "I'll send it to him today," Rawdon said, for day had dawned again, and many hours had passed in this search. "And I will pay Briggs, who was kind to the boy, and some of the debts. You will let me know where I shall send the rest to you." "You might have spared me £100, Becky, out of all this. I have always shared with you." "I am innocent," said Becky. And he left her without another word. What were her thoughts when he left her? She remained for hours after he was gone, the sunshine pouring into the room, and Rebecca sitting alone on the bed's edge. The drawers were all opened, and their contents scattered about, dresses and feathers, scarfs and trinkets, a heap of tumbled vanities lying in a wreck. Her hair was falling over her shoulders, her gown was torn where Rawdon had wrenched the brilliants out of it. She heard him go downstairs a few minutes after he left her, and the door slamming and closing on him. She knew he would never come back. He was gone forever. Would he kill himself? She thought. Not until after he had met Lord Steyne. She thought of her long-past life and all the dismal incidents of it. Ah, how dreary it seemed, how miserable, lonely, profitless. Should she take laudanum and end it, too, have done with all hopes, schemes, debts, and triumphs? The French maid found her in this position, sitting in the midst of her miserable ruins with clasped hands and dry eyes. The woman was her accomplice, and in Steyne's pay. "Mon Dieu, madame, what has happened?" she asked. What had happened? Was she guilty or not? She said not. But who could tell what was truth which came from those lips, or if that corrupt heart was, in this case, pure? All her lies and her schemes, all her selfishness and her wiles, all her wit and genius had come to this bankruptcy. The woman closed the curtains, and with some entreaty and show of kindness persuaded her mistress to lie down on the bed. Then she went below and gathered up the trinkets which had been lying on the floor, since Rebecca dropped them there at her husband's orders, and Lord Steyne went away. End of chapter 53.
Chapter 9 of Little Women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 9. Meg Goes to Vanity Fair. "I do think it was the most fortunate thing in the world those children should have the measles just now," said Meg, one April day as she stood packing the go-abroady trunk in her room, surrounded by her sisters. And so nice of Annie Moffat not to forget her promise. A whole fortnight of fun will be regularly splendid," replied Jo, looking like a windmill as she folded skirts with her long arms. "And such lovely weather. I'm so glad of that," added Beth, tidily sorting neck and hair ribbons in her best box, lent for the great occasion. "I wish I was going to have a fine time and wear all these nice things," said Amy, with her mouth full of pins, as she artistically replenished her sister's cushion. "I wish you were all going, but as you can't, I shall keep my adventures to tell you when I come back. I'm sure it's the least I can do when you've been so kind, lending me things and helping me get ready," said Meg, glancing round the room at the very simple outfit, which seemed nearly perfect in their eyes. "What did Mother give you out of the treasure box?" asked Amy, who had not been present at the opening of a certain cedar chest in which Mrs. March kept a few relics of past splendor, as gifts for her girls when the proper time came. "A pair of silk stockings, that pretty carved fan, and a lovely blue sash. I wanted the violet silk, but there isn't time to make it over, so I must be contented with my old tarlatan. It will look nice over my new muslin skirt, and the sash will set it off beautifully. I wish I hadn't smashed my coral bracelet, for you might have had it," said Jo, who loved to give and lend, but whose possessions were usually too dilapidated to be of much use. "There is a lovely old-fashioned pearl set in the treasure chest, but Mother said real flowers were the prettiest ornament for a young girl, and Laurie promised to send me all I want," replied Meg. "Now let me see. There's my new gray walking suit. Just curl up the feather in my hat, Beth. Then my poplin for Sunday and the small party. It looks heavy for spring, doesn't it? The violet silk would be so nice. Oh, dear." "Never mind, you've got the tarlatan for the big party, and you always look like an angel in white," said Amy, brooding over the little store of finery in which her soul delighted. "It isn't low-necked, and it doesn't sweep enough, but it will have to do. My blue house dress looks so well, turned and freshly trimmed, that I feel as if I've got a new one. My silk sack isn't a bit the fashion, and my bonnet doesn't look like Sally's. I didn't like to say anything, but I was sadly disappointed in my umbrella. I told Mother black with a white handle, but she forgot and bought a green one with a yellowish handle. It's strong and neat, so I ought not to complain, but I know I shall feel ashamed of it beside Annie's silk one with a gold top," sighed Meg, surveying the little umbrella with great disfavor. "Change it," advised Jo. "I won't be so silly, or hurt Marmy's feelings, when she took so much pains to get my things. It's a nonsensical notion of mine, and I'm not going to give up to it. My silk stockings and 2 pairs of new gloves are my comfort. You are a dear to lend me yours, Jo. I feel so rich and sort of elegant, with 2 new pairs and the old ones cleaned up for common," and Meg took a refreshing peep at her glove box. "Annie Moffat has blue and pink bows on her nightcaps. Would you put some on mine?" she asked, as Beth brought up a pile of snowy muslins, fresh from Hannah's hands. "No, I wouldn't, for the smart caps won't match the plain gowns without any trimming on them. Poor folks shouldn't rig," said Jo decidedly. "I wonder if I shall ever be happy enough to have real lace on my clothes and bows on my caps," said Meg impatiently. "You said the other day that you'd be perfectly happy if only you could go to Annie Moffat's," observed Beth in her quiet way. "So I did. Well, I am happy, and I won't fret, but it does seem as if the more one gets, the more one wants, doesn't it? There now, the trays are ready, and everything in but my ball dress, which I shall leave for Mother to pack," said Meg, cheering up, as she glanced from the half-filled trunk to the many times pressed and mended white tarlatan, which she called her ball dress with an important air. The next day was fine, and Meg departed in style for a fortnight of novelty and pleasure. Mrs. March had consented to the visit rather reluctantly, fearing that Margaret would come back more discontented than she went. But she begged so hard, and Sally had promised to take good care of her, and a little pleasure seemed so delightful after a winter of irksome work, that the mother yielded, and the daughter went to take her first taste of fashionable life. The Moffats were very fashionable, and simple Meg was rather daunted at first by the splendor of the house and the elegance of its occupants. But they were kindly people, in spite of the frivolous life they led, and soon put their guest at her ease. Perhaps Meg felt, without understanding why, that they were not particularly cultivated or intelligent people, and that all their gilding could not quite conceal the ordinary material of which they were made. It certainly was agreeable to fare sumptuously, drive in a fine carriage, wear her best frock every day, and do nothing but enjoy herself. It suited her exactly, and soon she began to imitate the manners and conversation of those about her, to put on little airs and graces, use French phrases, crimp her hair, take in her dresses, and talk about the fashions as well as she could. The more she saw of Annie Moffat's pretty things, the more she envied her and sighed to be rich. Home now looked bare and dismal as she thought of it. Work grew harder than ever, and she felt that she was a very destitute and much injured girl, in spite of the new gloves and silk stockings. She had not much time for repining, however, for the 3 young girls were busily employed in having a good time. They shopped, walked, rode, and called all day, went to theaters and operas or frolicked at home in the evening, for Annie had many friends and knew how to entertain them. Her older sisters were very fine young ladies, and one was engaged, which was extremely interesting and romantic, Meg thought. Mr. Moffat was a fat, jolly old gentleman who knew her father, and Mrs. Moffat a fat, jolly old lady who took as great a fancy to Meg as her daughter had done. Everyone petted her, and Daisy, as they called her, was in a fair way to have her head turned. When the evening for the small party came, she found that the poplin wouldn't do at all, for the other girls were putting on thin dresses and making themselves very fine indeed. So out came the tarletan, looking older, limper, and shabbier than ever beside Sally's crisp new one. Meg saw the girls glance at it, and then at one another, and her cheeks began to burn, for with all her gentleness she was very proud. No one said a word about it, but Sally offered to dress her hair, and Annie to tie her sash, and Belle, the engaged sister, praised her white arms. But in their kindness Meg saw only pity for her poverty, and her heart felt very heavy as she stood by herself, while the others laughed, chattered, and flew about like gauzy butterflies. The hard, bitter feeling was getting pretty bad, when the maid brought in a box of flowers. Before she could speak, Annie had the cover off, and all were exclaiming at the lovely roses, heath, and fern within. "It's for Belle, of course. George always sends her some, but these are altogether ravishing," cried Annie, with a great sniff. "They are for Miss March," the man said, "and here's a note," put in the maid, holding it to Meg. "What fun! Who are they from? Didn't know you had a lover," cried the girls, fluttering about Meg in a high state of curiosity and surprise. "The note is from Mother, and the flowers from Laurie," said Meg simply, yet much gratified that he had not forgotten her. "Oh, indeed," said Annie, with a funny look, as Meg slipped the note into her pocket as a sort of talisman against envy, vanity, and false pride, for the few loving words had done her good, and the flowers cheered her up by their beauty. Feeling almost happy again, she laid by a few ferns and roses for herself, and quickly made up the rest in dainty bouquets for the breasts, hair, or skirts of her friends, offering them so prettily that Clara, the elder sister, told her she was the sweetest little thing she ever saw, and they looked quite charmed with her small attention. Somehow the kind act finished her despondency, and when all the rest went to show themselves to Mrs. Moffat, she saw a happy, bright-eyed face in the mirror, and she laid her ferns against her rippling hair, and fastened the roses in the dress that didn't strike her as so very shabby now. She enjoyed herself very much that evening, for she danced to her heart's content. Everyone was very kind, and she had 3 compliments. Annie made her sing, and someone said she had a remarkably fine voice. Major Lincoln asked who "the fresh little girl with the beautiful eyes" was, and Mr. Moffat insisted on dancing with her because "she didn't dawdle, but had some spring in her," as he gracefully expressed it. So altogether she had a very nice time, till she overheard a bit of conversation which disturbed her extremely. She was sitting just inside the conservatory, waiting for her partner to bring her an ice, when she heard a voice ask on the other side of the flowery wall, "How old is he?" 16 or 17, I should say," replied another voice. "It would be a grand thing for one of those girls, wouldn't it? Sally says they are very intimate now, and the old man quite dotes on them." "Mrs. M. has made her plans, I dare say, and will play her cards well, early as it is. The girl evidently doesn't think of it yet," said Mrs. Moffat. "She told that fib about her mamma as if she did know, and colored up when the flowers came quite prettily. Poor thing! She'd be so nice if only she was got up in style. Do you think she'd be offended if we offered to lend her a dress for Thursday?" asked another voice. "She's proud, but I don't believe she'd mind, for that dowdy tarlatan is all she has got. She may tear it tonight, and that will be a good excuse for offering a decent one." Here Meg's partner appeared, to find her looking much flushed and rather agitated. She was proud, and her pride was useful just then, for it helped her hide her mortification, anger, and disgust at what she had just heard. For innocent and unsuspicious as she was, she could not help understanding the gossip of her friends. She tried to forget it, but could not, and kept repeating to herself, "Mrs. M. has made her plans. That fib about her mamma, and dowdy tarlatan," till she was ready to cry and rush home to tell her troubles and ask for advice. As that was impossible, she did her best to seem gay, and being rather excited, she succeeded so well that no one dreamed what an effort she was making. She was very glad when it was all over, and she was quiet in her bed, where she could think and wonder and fume till her head ached and her hot cheeks were cooled by a few natural tears. Those foolish yet well-meant words had opened a new world to Meg, and much disturbed the peace of the old one, in which till now she had lived as happily as a child. Her innocent friendship with Laurie was spoiled by the silly speeches she had overheard. Her faith in her mother was a little shaken by the worldly plans attributed to her by Mrs. Moffat, who judged others by herself, and the sensible resolution to be contented with the simple wardrobe which suited a poor man's daughter was weakened by the unnecessary pity of girls who thought a shabby dress one of the greatest calamities under heaven. Poor Meg had a restless night, and got up heavy-eyed, unhappy, half resentful towards her friends, and half ashamed of herself for not speaking out frankly and setting everything right. Everybody dawdled that morning, and it was noon before the girls found energy enough even to take up their worsted work. Something in the manner of her friends struck Meg at once. They treated her with more respect, she thought, took quite a tender interest in what she said, and looked at her with eyes that plainly betrayed curiosity. All this surprised and flattered her, though she did not understand it till Miss Bell looked up from her writing, and said, with a sentimental air, "Daisy, dear, I've sent an invitation to your friend, Mr. Lawrence, for Thursday. We should like to know him, and it's only a proper compliment to you." Meg colored, but a mischievous fancy to tease the girls made her reply demurely, "You are very kind, but I'm afraid he won't come." "Why not, Cherie?" asked Miss Bell. "He's too old." "My child, what do you mean? What is his age, I beg to know?" cried Miss Clara. "Nearly 70, I believe," answered Meg, counting stitches to hide the merriment in her eyes. "You sly creature! Of course we meant the young man," exclaimed Miss Bell, laughing. "There isn't any. Laurie is only a little boy." And Meg laughed also at the queer look which the sisters exchanged as she thus described her supposed lover. "About your age," Nan said. "Nearer my sister Joe's. I am 17 in August," returned Meg, tossing her head. "It's very nice of him to send you flowers, isn't it?" said Annie, looking wise about nothing. "Yes, he often does, to all of us, for their house is full, and we are so fond of them. My mother and old Mr. Lawrence are friends, you know, so it is quite natural that we children should play together." And Meg hoped they would say no more. "It's evident Daisy isn't out yet," said Miss Clara to Belle with a nod. "Quite a pastoral state of innocence all round," returned Miss Bell with a shrug. "I'm going out to get some little matters for my girls. Can I do anything for you, young ladies?" asked Mrs. Moffat, lumbering in like an elephant in silk and lace. "No, thank you, ma'am," replied Sally. I've got my new pink silk for Thursday and don't want a thing." "Nor I," began Meg, but stopped because it occurred to her that she did want several things and could not have them. "What shall you wear?" asked Sally. "My old white one again, if I can mend it fit to be seen. It got sadly torn last night," said Meg, trying to speak quite easily, but feeling very uncomfortable. "Why don't you send home for another?" said Sally, who was not an observing young lady. "I haven't got any other." It cost Meg an effort to say that, but Sally did not see it, and exclaimed in amiable surprise, "Only that? How funny!" She did not finish her speech, for Belle shook her head at her and broke in, saying kindly, "Not at all. Where's the use of having a lot of dresses when she isn't out yet? There's no need of sending home, Daisy, even if you had a dozen, for I've got a sweet blue silk laid away which I've outgrown, and you shall wear it to please me, won't you, dear?" "You are very kind, but I don't mind my old dress if you don't. It does well enough for a little girl like me," said Meg. "Now do let me please myself by dressing you up in style. I admire to do it, and you'd be a regular little beauty with a touch here and there. I shan't let anyone see you till you are done, and then we'll burst upon them like Cinderella and her godmother going to the ball," said Belle in her persuasive tone. Meg couldn't refuse the offer so kindly made, for a desire to see if she would be a little beauty, after touching up, caused her to accept, and forget all her former uncomfortable feelings towards the Moffats. On the Thursday evening Belle shut herself up with her maid, and between them they turned Meg into a fine lady. They crimped and curled her hair, they polished her neck and arms with some fragrant powder, touched her lips with a coralline salve to make them redder, and Hortense would have added a soupçon of rouge if Meg had not rebelled. They laced her into a sky-blue dress, which was so tight she could hardly breathe, and so low in the neck that modest Meg blushed at herself in the mirror. A set of silver filigree was added, bracelets, necklace, brooch, and even earrings, for Hortense tied them on with a bit of pink silk which did not show. A cluster of tea roses at the bosom, and a ruche, reconciled Meg to the display of her pretty white shoulders, and a pair of high-heeled silk boots satisfied the last wish of her heart. A lace handkerchief, a plumy fan, and a bouquet in a shoulder-holder finished her off, and Miss Belle surveyed her with the satisfaction of a little girl with a newly dressed doll. "Mademoiselle is charmante, très jolie, is she not?" cried Hortense, clasping her hands in an affected rapture. "Come and show yourself," said Miss Belle, leading the way to the room where the others were waiting. As Meg went rustling after, with her long skirts trailing, her earrings tinkling, her curls waving, and her heart beating, she felt as if her fun had really begun at last, for the mirror had plainly told her that she was a little beauty. Her friends repeated the pleasing phrase enthusiastically, and for several minutes she stood, like a jackdaw in the fable, enjoying her borrowed plumes, while the rest chattered like a party of magpies. "While I dress, do you drill her, Nan, in the management of her skirt and those French heels, or she will trip herself up. Take your silver butterfly, and catch up that long curl on the left side of her head, Clara, and don't any of you disturb the charming work of my hands," said Belle, as she hurried away, looking well pleased with her success. "You don't look a bit like yourself, but you are very nice. I'm nowhere beside you, for Belle has heaps of taste, and you're quite French, I assure you. Let your flowers hang, don't be so careful of them, and be sure you don't trip," returned Sally, trying not to care that Meg was prettier than herself. Keeping that warning carefully in mind, Margaret got safely downstairs and sailed into the drawing-rooms where the Moffats and a few early guests were assembled. She very soon discovered that there is a charm about fine clothes which attracts a certain class of people and secures their respect. Several young ladies who had taken no notice of her before were very affectionate all of a sudden. Several young gentlemen, who had only stared at her at the other party, now not only stared, but asked to be introduced, and said all manner of foolish but agreeable things to her, and several old ladies who sat on the sofas and criticized the rest of the party, inquired who she was with an air of interest. She heard Mrs. Moffat reply to one of them, Daisy March, father a colonel in the army, one of our first families, but reverses of fortune, you know. Intimate friends of the Lawrences. Sweet creature, I assure you. My Ned is quite wild about her." "Dear me," said the old lady, putting up her glass for another observation of Meg, who tried to look as if she had not heard and been rather shocked at Mrs. Moffat's fibs. The queer feeling did not pass away, but she imagined herself acting the new part of fine lady, and so got on pretty well, though the tight dress gave her a side ache, the train kept getting under her feet, and she was in constant fear lest her earrings should fly off and get lost or broken. She was flirting her fan and laughing at the feeble jokes of a young gentleman who tried to be witty, when she suddenly stopped laughing and looked confused, for just opposite she saw Laurie. He was staring at her with undisguised surprise, and disapproval also, she thought, for though he bowed and smiled, yet something in his honest eyes made her blush and wish she had her old dress on. To complete her confusion, she saw Belle nudge Annie, and both glance from her to Laurie, who, she was happy to see, looked unusually boyish and shy. "Silly creatures, to put such thoughts into my head. I won't care for it, or let it change me a bit," thought Meg, and rustled across the room to shake hands with her friend. "I'm glad you came. I was afraid you wouldn't," she said, with her most grown-up air. "Joe wanted me to come and tell her how you looked, so I did," answered Laurie, without turning his eyes upon her, though he half smiled at her maternal tone. "What shall you tell her?" asked Meg, full of curiosity to know his opinion of her, yet feeling ill at ease with him for the first time. "I shall say I didn't know you, for you look so grown up and unlike yourself I'm quite afraid of you," he said, fumbling at his glove button. "How absurd of you! The girls dressed me up for fun, and I rather like it. Wouldn't Jo stare if she saw me?" said Meg, bent on making him say whether he thought her improved or not. "Yes, I think she would," returned Laurie gravely. "Don't you like me so?" asked Meg. "No, I don't," was the blunt reply. "Why not?" in an anxious tone. He glanced at her frizzled head, bare shoulders, and fantastically trimmed dress with an expression that abashed her more than his answer, which had not a particle of his usual politeness in it. "I don't like fuss and feathers." This was altogether too much from a lad younger than herself, and Meg walked away, saying petulantly, "You are the rudest boy I ever saw." Feeling very much ruffled, she went and stood at a quiet window to cool her cheeks, for the tight dress gave her an uncomfortably brilliant color. As she stood there, Major Lincoln passed by, and a minute after she heard him saying to his mother, "They are making a fool of that little girl. I wanted you to see her, but they have spoiled her entirely. She's nothing but a doll tonight." "Oh, dear," sighed Meg. "I wish I'd been sensible and worn my own things. Then I should not have disgusted other people or felt so uncomfortable and ashamed of myself." She leaned her forehead on the cool pane and stood half hidden by the curtains, never minding that her favorite waltz had begun, till someone touched her, and turning she saw Laurie, looking penitent, as he said, with his very best bow and his hand out, "Please forgive my rudeness, and come and dance with me." "I'm afraid it will be too disagreeable to you," said Meg, trying to look offended and failing entirely. "Not a bit of it. I'm dying to do it. Come, I'll be good. I don't like your gown, but I do think you are just splendid." And he waved his hands as if words failed to express his admiration. Meg smiled and relented, and whispered as they stood waiting to catch the time, "Take care my skirt doesn't trip you up. It's the plague of my life, and I was a goose to wear it." "Pin it round your neck, and then it will be useful," said Laurie, looking down at the little blue boots, which he evidently approved of. Away they went fleetly and gracefully, for having practiced at home they were well matched, and the blithe young couple were a pleasant sight to see, as they twirled merrily round and round, feeling more friendly than ever after their small tiff. "Laurie, I want you to do me a favor, will you?" said Meg, as he stood fanning her when her breath gave out, which it did very soon, though she would not own why. "Won't I?" said Laurie, with alacrity. "Please don't tell them at home about my dress tonight. They won't understand the joke, and it will worry Mother." "Then why did you do it?" said Laurie's eyes so plainly that Meg hastily added, I shall tell them myself all about it, and fess to Mother how silly I've been, but I'd rather do it myself. So you'll not tell, will you? I give you my word I won't. Only what shall I say when they ask me? Just say I looked pretty well and was having a good time. I'll say the first with all my heart, but how about the other? You don't look as if you were having a good time. Are you? And Laurie looked at her with an expression which made her answer in a whisper. No, not just now. Don't think I'm horrid. I only wanted a little fun, but this sort doesn't pay, I find, and I'm getting tired of it. Here comes Ned Moffat. What does he want? Said Laurie, knitting his black brows as if he did not regard his young host in the light of a pleasant addition to the party. He put his name down for 3 dances, and I suppose he's coming for them. What a bore, said Meg, assuming a languid air which amused Laurie immensely. He did not speak to her again till supper-time, when he saw her drinking champagne with Ned and his friend Fisher, who were behaving "like a pair of fools," as Laurie said to himself, for he felt a brotherly sort of right to watch over the Marches and fight their battles whenever a defender was needed. You'll have a splitting headache tomorrow if you drink much of that. I wouldn't, Meg. Your mother doesn't like it, you know, he whispered, leaning over her chair, as Ned turned to refill her glass and Fisher stooped to pick up her fan. I'm not Meg tonight. I'm a doll who does all sorts of crazy things. Tomorrow I shall put away my fuss and feathers and be desperately good again, she answered with an affected little laugh. Wish tomorrow was here, then, muttered Laurie, walking off, ill-pleased at the change he saw in her. Meg danced and flirted, chattered and giggled as the other girls did. After supper she undertook the German, and blundered through it, nearly upsetting her partner with her long skirt, and romping in a way that scandalized Laurie, who looked on and meditated a lecture. But he got no chance to deliver it, for Meg kept away from him till he came to say good night. Remember, she said, trying to smile, for the splitting headache had already begun. Silence à la mort, replied Laurie, with a melodramatic flourish as he went away. This little bit of by-play excited Annie's curiosity, but Meg was too tired for gossip and went to bed, feeling as if she had been to a masquerade and hadn't enjoyed herself as much as she had expected. She was sick all the next day, and on Saturday she went home, quite used up with her fortnight's fun, and feeling that she had sat in the lap of luxury long enough. It does seem pleasant to be quiet, and not have company manners on all the time. Home is a nice place, though it isn't splendid, said Meg, looking about her with restful expression, as she sat with her mother and Joe on the Sunday evening. I'm glad to hear you say so, dear, for I was afraid home would seem dull and poor to you after your fine quarters, replied her mother, who had given her many anxious looks that day, for motherly eyes are quick to see any change in children's faces. Meg had told her adventures gaily, and said over and over what a charming time she had had, but something still seemed to weigh upon her spirits, and when the younger girls were gone to bed, she sat thoughtfully staring at the fire, saying little and looking worried. As the clock struck 9 and Joe proposed bed, Meg suddenly left her chair, and taking Beth's stool, leaned her elbows on her mother's knee, saying bravely, Marmee, I want to fess. I thought so. What is it, dear? Shall I go away? Asked Joe discreetly. Of course not. Don't I always tell you everything? I was ashamed to speak of it before the younger children, but I want you to know all the dreadful things I did at the Moffats. We are prepared, said Mrs. March, smiling but looking a little anxious. I told you they dressed me up, but I didn't tell you that they powdered and squeezed and frizzled and made me look like a fashion plate. Laurie thought I wasn't proper. I know he did, though he didn't say so, and one man called me a doll. I knew it was silly, but they flattered me and said I was a beauty, and quantities of nonsense, so I let them make a fool of me. Is that all? Asked Joe, as Mrs. March looked silently at the downcast face of her pretty daughter, and could not find it in her heart to blame her little follies. No, I drank champagne, and romped and tried to flirt, and was altogether abominable, said Meg self-reproachfully. There is something more, I think. And Mrs. March smoothed the soft cheek, which suddenly grew rosy as Meg answered slowly. Yes, it's very silly, but I want to tell it, because I hate to have people say and think such things about us and Laurie." Then she told the various bits of gossip she had heard at the Moffats, and as she spoke Joe saw her mother fold her lips tightly, as if ill-pleased that such ideas should be put into Meg's innocent mind. "Well, if that isn't the greatest rubbish I ever heard," cried Joe indignantly. "Why didn't you pop out and tell them so on the spot?" "I couldn't. It was so embarrassing for me. I couldn't help hearing at first, and then I was so angry and ashamed, I didn't remember that I ought to go away." "Just wait till I see Annie Moffat, and I'll show you how to settle such ridiculous stuff. The idea of having plans, and being kind to Laurie because he's rich and may marry us by and by. Oh, won't he shout when I tell him what those silly things say about us poor children?" And Joe laughed, as if on second thoughts the thing struck her as a good joke. "If you tell Laurie I'll never forgive you, she mustn't, must she, Mother?" said Meg, looking distressed. "No, never repeat that foolish gossip, and forget it as soon as you can," said Mrs. March gravely. "I was very unwise to let you go among people of whom I know so little. Kind, I dare say, but worldly, ill-bred, and full of these vulgar ideas about young people. I am more sorry than I can express for the mischief this visit may have done you, Meg." "Don't be sorry. I won't let it hurt me. I'll forget all the bad and remember only the good, for I did enjoy a great deal, and thank you very much for letting me go. I'll not be sentimental or dissatisfied, Mother. I know I'm a silly little girl, and I'll stay with you till I'm fit to take care of myself. But it is nice to be praised and admired, and I can't help saying I like it," said Meg, looking half ashamed of the confession. "That is perfectly natural, and quite harmless, if the liking does not become a passion, and lead one to do foolish or unmaidenly things. Learn to know and value the praise which is worth having, and to excite the admiration of excellent people by being modest as well as pretty, Meg." Margaret sat thinking a moment, while Jo stood with her hands behind her, looking both interested and a little perplexed, for it was a new thing to see Meg blushing, and talking about admiration, lovers, and things of that sort. And Jo felt as if during the fortnight her sister had grown up amazingly, and was drifting away from her into a world where she could not follow. "Mother, do you have plans, as Mrs. Moffat said?" asked Meg bashfully. "Yes, my dear, I have a great many. All mothers do, but mine differ somewhat from Mrs. Moffat's, I suspect. I will tell you some of them, for the time has come when a word may set this romantic little head and heart of yours right, on a very serious subject. You are young, Meg, but not too young to understand me, and mother's lips are the fittest to speak of such things to girls like you. Jo, your turn will come in time, perhaps, so listen to my plans and help me carry them out, if they are good." Jo went and sat on one arm of the chair, looking as if she thought they were about to join in some very solemn affair. Holding a hand of each, and watching the two young faces wistfully, Mrs. March said, in her serious yet cheery way, "I want my daughters to be beautiful, accomplished, and good, to be admired, loved, and respected, to have a happy youth, to be well and wisely married, and to lead useful, pleasant lives, with as little care and sorrow to try them as God sees fit to send. To be loved and chosen by a good man is the best and sweetest thing which can happen to a woman, and I sincerely hope my girls may know this beautiful experience. It is natural to think of it, Meg, right to hope and wait for it, and wise to prepare for it, so that when the happy time comes, you may feel ready for the duties and worthy of the joy. My dear girls, I am ambitious for you, but not to have you make a dash in the world, marry rich men merely because they are rich, or have splendid houses which are not homes because love is wanting. Money is a needful and precious thing, and when well used, a noble thing, but I never want you to think it is the first or only prize to strive for. I'd rather see you poor men's wives if you were happy, beloved, contented, than queens on thrones, without self-respect and peace." "Poor girls don't stand any chance, Belle says, unless they put themselves forward," sighed Meg. "Then we'll be old maids," said Jo stoutly. Right, Joe. Better be happy old maids than unhappy wives, or unmaidenly girls running about to find husbands," said Mrs. March decidedly. "Don't be troubled, Meg. Poverty seldom daunts a sincere lover. Some of the best and most honored women I know were poor girls, but so love-worthy that they were not allowed to be old maids. Leave these things to time. Make this home happy, so that you may be fit for homes of your own, if they are offered you, and contented here if they are not. One thing remember, my girls. Mother is always ready to be your confidant, father to be your friend, and both of us hope and trust that our daughters, whether married or single, will be the pride and comfort of our lives." "We will, Marmee, we will," cried both, with all their hearts, as she bade them good night. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 12 of the Burgess Bird Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jan MacGillivray.
With Scott MacGillivray.
The Burgess Bird Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 12. Some Unlikely Relatives. The Cowbird and the Baltimore Oriole.
Having other things to attend to, or rather having other things to arouse his curiosity, Peter Rabbit did not visit the old orchard for several days. When he did, it was to find the entire neighborhood quite upset. There was an indignation meeting in progress, in and around the tree in which Chebec and his modest little wife had their home. How the tongues did clatter! Peter knew that something had happened, but though he listened with all his might, he couldn't make head or tail of it. Finally, Peter managed to get the attention of Jenny Wren. "What's happened?" demanded Peter. "What's all this fuss about?"
Jenny Wren was so excited that she couldn't keep still an instant. Her sharp little eyes snapped, and her tail was carried higher than ever. "It's a disgrace! It's a disgrace to the whole feathered race, and something ought to be done about it," sputtered Jenny. "I'm ashamed to think that such a contemptible creature wears feathers. I am so—"
"But what's it all about?" demanded Peter impatiently. "Do keep still long enough to tell me. Who is this contemptible creature?"
"Sally Sly," snapped Jenny Wren. "Sally Sly the cowbird. I hoped she wouldn't disgrace the old orchard this year, but she has. When Mr. and Mrs. Chebec returned from getting their breakfast this morning, they found one of Sally Sly's eggs in their nest. They are terribly upset, and I don't blame them. If I were in their place, I simply would throw that egg out. That's what I'd do. I'd throw that egg out."
Peter was puzzled. He blinked his eyes and stroked his whiskers as he tried to understand what it all meant. "Who is Sally Sly, and what did she do that for?" he finally ventured.
"For goodness sake, Peter Rabbit, do you mean to tell me you don't know who Sally Sly is?" Then, without waiting for Peter to reply, Jenny rattled on. "She's a member of the blackbird family, and she's the laziest, most good-for-nothing, sneakiest, most unfeeling, and most selfish wretch I know of." Jenny paused long enough to get her breath. "She laid that egg in Chebec's nest because she is too lazy to build a nest of her own and too selfish to take care of her own children. Do you know what will happen, Peter Rabbit? Do you know what will happen?"
Peter shook his head and confessed that he didn't.
"When that egg hatches out, that young cowbird will be about twice as big as Chebec's own children," sputtered Jenny. "He'll be so big that he'll get most of the food. He'll just rob those little Chebecs in spite of all their mother and father can do. And Chebec and his wife will be just soft-hearted enough to work themselves to skin and bone to feed the young wretch, because he is an orphan and hasn't anybody to look after him. The worst of it is, Sally Sly is likely to play the same trick on others. She always chooses the nest of someone smaller than herself. She's terribly sly. No one has seen her about. She just sneaked into the old orchard this morning when everybody was busy, laid that egg, and sneaked out again.
Did you say that she is a member of the Blackbird family? Asked Peter.
Jenny Wren nodded vigorously. That's what she is, said she. Thank goodness she isn't a member of my family. If she were, I never would be able to hold my head up. Just listen to Goldie the Oriole over in that big elm. I don't see how he can sing like that, knowing that one of his relatives has just done such a shameful deed. It's a queer thing that there can be two members of the same family so unlike. Mrs. Goldie builds one of the most wonderful nests of anyone I know, and Sally Sly is too lazy to build any. If I were in Goldie's place,
Hold on, cried Peter. I thought you said Sally Sly is a member of the Blackbird family. I don't see what she's got to do with Goldie the Oriole.
You don't, eh? Exclaimed Jenny. Well, for one who pokes into other people's affairs as you do, you don't know much. The orioles and the meadowlarks and the grackles and the bobolinks all belong to the blackbird family. They're all related to Redwing the blackbird, and Sally Sly the cowbird belongs in the same family.
Peter gasped. I hadn't the least idea that any of these folks were related, stammered Peter.
Well, they are, retorted Jenny Wren. As I live, there's Sally Sly now.
Peter caught a glimpse of a brownish-gray bird, who reminded him somewhat of Mrs. Redwing. She was about the same size, and looked very much like her. It was plain that she was trying to keep out of sight, and the instant she knew that she'd been discovered, she flew away in the direction of the old pasture. It happened that late that afternoon, Peter visited the old pasture and saw her again. She and some of her friends were busily walking about close to the feet of the cows, where they seemed to be picking up food. One had a brown head, neck, and breast. The rest of his coat was glossy black. Peter rightly guessed that this must be Mr. Cowbird. Seeing them on such good terms with the cows, he understood why they are called cowbirds. Sure that Sally Sly had left the old orchard, the feathered folks settled down to their personal affairs and household cares, Jenny Wren among them. Having no one to talk to, Peter found a shady place close to the old stone wall, and there sat down to think over the surprising things he had learned.
Presently, Goldie the Baltimore Oriole alighted in the nearest apple tree, and it seemed to Peter that never had he seen anyone more beautifully dressed. His head, neck, throat, and upper part of his back were black. The lower part of his back and his breast were a beautiful deep orange color. There was a dash of orange on his shoulders, but the rest of his wings were black with an edging of white. His tail was black and orange. Peter had heard him called the Firebird, and now he understood why. His song was quite as rich and beautiful as his coat. Shortly he was joined by Mrs. Goldie. Compared with her handsome husband, she was very modestly dressed. She wore more brown than black, and where the orange color appeared, it was rather dull. She wasted no time in singing. Almost instantly, her sharp eyes spied a piece of string caught in the bushes almost over Peter's head. With a little cry of delight, she flew down and seized it. But the string was caught, and though she tugged and pulled with all her might, she couldn't get it free. Goldie saw the trouble she was having, and cutting his song short, flew down to help her. Together they pulled and tugged and pulled until they had to stop to rest and get their breath. "We simply must have this piece of string," said Mrs. Goldie. "I've been hunting everywhere for a piece, and this is the first I've found. It is just what we need to bind our nest fast to the twigs. With this I won't have the least bit of fear that that nest will ever tear loose. no matter how hard the wind blows. Once more they tugged and pulled and tugged until at last they got it free, and Mrs. Goldie flew away in triumph with the string in her bill. Goldie himself followed.
Peter watched them fly to the top of a long, swaying branch of a big elm tree up near Farmer Brown's house. He could see something which looked like a bag hanging there, and he knew that this must be the nest. "Gracious," said Peter, "they must get terribly tossed about when the wind blows. I should think their babies would be thrown out." "Don't you worry about them," said a voice. Peter looked up to find Welcome Robin just over him. "Mrs. Goldie makes one of the most wonderful nests I know of," continued Welcome Robin. "It's like a deep pocket made of grass, string, hair, and bark, all woven together like a piece of cloth. It is so deep that it's quite safe for the babies, and they seem to enjoy being rocked by the wind. I shouldn't care for it myself, because I like a solid foundation for my home, but the Goldies like it. It looks dangerous, but it is really one of the safest nests I know of. Snakes and cats never get way up there, and there are few feathered nest robbers who can get at those eggs so deep down in the nest. Goldie is sometimes called Golden Robin. He isn't a robin at all, but I'd feel very proud if he were a member of my family. He's just as useful as he is handsome, and that's saying a great deal. He just dotes on caterpillars. There's Mrs. Robin calling me. Goodbye, Peter."
With this, Welcome Robin flew away, and Peter once more settled himself to think over all he had learned. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Jan MacGillivray.
With Scott MacGillivray.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by A.R. Dobbs, San Francisco, California. Adam Bede by George Eliot. So that ye may have clear images before your gladdened eyes of nature's unambitious underwood and flowers that prosper in the shade. And when I speak of such among the flock as swerved or fell, those only shall be singled out upon whose lapse or error something more than brotherly forgiveness may attend. Wordsworth. Book 1, Chapter 1. The Workshop. With a single drop of ink for a mirror, the Egyptian sorcerer undertakes to reveal to any chance comer far-reaching visions of the past. This is what I undertake to do for you, reader. With this drop of ink at the end of my pen, I will show you the roomy workshop of Mr. Jonathan Burge, carpenter and builder in the village of Hayslope, as it appeared on the 18th of June, in the year of our Lord, 1799. The afternoon sun was warm on the 5 workmen there, busy upon doors and window frames and wainscoting. A scent of pine wood from a tent-like pile of planks outside the open door mingled itself with the scent of the elder bushes which were spreading their summer snow close to the open window opposite. The slanting sunbeams shone through the transparent shavings that flew before the steady plane and lit up the fine grain of the oak paneling which stood propped against the wall. On a heap of those soft shavings a rough gray shepherd dog had made himself a pleasant bed, and was lying with his nose between his forepaws, occasionally wrinkling his brows to cast a glance at the tallest of the 5 workmen, who was carving a shield in the center of a wooden mantelpiece. It was to this workman that the strong baritone belonged, which was heard above the sound of plane and hammer, singing, "Awake, my soul, and with the sun thy daily stage of duty run. Shake off dull sloth." Here some measurement was to be taken which required more concentrated attention, and the sonorous voice subsided into a low whistle, but it presently broke out again with renewed vigor. "Let all thy converse be sincere, thy conscience as the noonday clear. Such a voice could only come from a broad chest, and the broad chest belonged to a large-boned, muscular man nearly 6 feet high, with a back so flat and a head so well poised that when he drew himself up to take a more distant survey of his work, he had the air of a soldier standing at ease. The sleeve rolled up above the elbow showed an arm that was likely to win the prize for feats of strength. Yet the long, supple hand, with its broad finger-tips, looked ready for works of skill. In his tall stalwartness, Adam Bede was a Saxon, and justified his name. But the jet-black hair, made the more noticeable by its contrast with the light paper cap, and the keen glance of the dark eyes that shone from under strongly marked, prominent and mobile eyebrows, indicated a mixture of Celtic blood. The face was large and roughly hewn, and when in repose had no other beauty than such as belongs to an expression of good-humored, honest intelligence. It is clear at a glance that the next workman is Adam's brother. He is nearly as tall. He has the same type of features, the same hue of hair and complexion, but the strength of the family likeness seems only to render more conspicuous the remarkable difference of expression both in form and face. Seth's broad shoulders have a slight stoop. His eyes are gray, his eyebrows have less prominence and more repose than his brother's, and his glance, instead of being keen, is confiding and benign. He has thrown off his paper cap, and you see that his hair is not thick and straight like Adam's, but thin and wavy, allowing you to discern the exact contour of a coronal arch that predominates very decidedly over the brow. The idle tramps always felt sure they could get a copper from Seth. They scarcely ever spoke to Adam. The concert of the tools and Adam's voice was at last broken by Seth, who, lifting the door at which he had been working intently, placed it against the wall and said, "There, I've finished my door today, anyhow." The workmen all looked up. Jim Salt, a burly, red-haired man known as Sandy Jim, paused from his planing, and Adam said to Seth, with a sharp glance of surprise, "What, dost think thee'st finished the door?" "Aye, sure," said Seth, with answering surprise. "What's a-wanting to it?" A loud roar of laughter from the other 3 workmen made Seth look round confusedly. Adam did not join in the laughter, but there was a slight smile on his face as he said in a gentler tone than before, "Why, thee'st forgot the panels." The laughter burst out afresh as Seth clapped his hands to his head and coloured over brow and crown. "Hooray!" shouted a small, lithe fellow called Wiry Ben, running forward and seizing the door. "We'll hang up the door at the fur end of the shop, and write on it, 'Seth Bede, the Methody, his work.' Here, Jim, lend's hold of the red pot." "Nonsense," said Adam. "Let it alone, Ben Cranage. You'll mayhap be making such a slip yourself some day. You'll laugh at the other side of your mouth then." "Catch me at it, Adam. It'll be a good while afore my head's full of the Methodies," said Ben. "Nay, but it's often full of drink, and that's worse." Ben, however, had now got the red pot in his hand, and was about to begin writing his inscription, making, by way of preliminary, an imaginary S in the air. "Let it alone, will you?" Adam called out, laying down his tools, striding up to Ben, and seizing his right shoulder. "Let it alone, or I'll shake the soul out wi' your body." Ben shook in Adam's iron grasp, but, like a plucky small man as he was, he didn't mean to give in. With his left hand he snatched the brush from his powerless right, and made a movement as if he would perform the feat of writing with his left. In a moment Adam turned him round, seized his other shoulder, and pushing him along, pinned him against the wall. But now Seth spoke up. "Let be, Addy, let be. Ben will be joking. Why, he's i' the right to laugh at me. I canna help laughing at myself." "I shan't loose him till he promises to let the door alone," said Adam. "Come, Ben, lad," said Seth in a persuasive tone. "Don't let's have a quarrel about it. You know Adam will have his way. You may as well try to turn a wagon in a narrow lane. Say you'll leave the door alone, and make an end on't." "I binna frighted at Adam," said Ben, "but I donna mind saying as I'll let alone at your asking, Seth." "Come, that's wise of you, Ben," said Adam, laughing and relaxing his grasp. They all returned to their work now, but Wiry Ben, having had the worst in the bodily contest, was bent on retrieving that humiliation by a success in sarcasm. "Which was ye thinking on, Seth?" he began. "The pretty parson's face, or her sarmint, when ye forgot the panels?" "Come and hear her, Ben," said Seth good-humouredly. "She's going to preach on the Green tonight. Happen you'd get something to think on yourself then, instead of those wicked songs you're so fond on. Ye might get religion, and that'd be the best day's earnings ye ever made." "All a good time for that, Seth. I'll think about that when I'm a-going to settle i' life. Bachelors doesn't want such heavy earnin's. Happen I'll do the courting and the religion both together, as ye do, Seth. But ye wouldna ha' me get converted and chop in atween ye and that pretty preacher and carry her aff." "No fear o' that, Ben. She's neither for you nor for me to win, I doubt. Only you come and hear her, and you won't speak lightly on her again." "Well, I'm half a mind to ha' a look at her tonight, if there isn't good company at the Holly Bush. What'll she take for her text? Happen ye can tell me, Seth, if so be I shouldna come up a time for it. Will't be... What come ye out for to see? A prophetess? Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophetess, a uncommon pretty young woman." "Come, Ben," said Adam rather sternly, "you let the words of the Bible alone. You're going too far now." "What are ye a-turning round, Adam? I thought ye were dead again the woman preaching a while ago." "Nay, I'm not turning no way. I said naught about the women preaching. I said you let the Bible alone. You've got a jest book, hain't you, as you're rare and proud on? Keep your dirty fingers to that." "Why, you're getting as big a saint as Seth. You're going to the preaching tonight, I should think. You'll do finely to lead the singing. But I don't know what Parson Irwin'll say at his grand favourite Adam Bede a-turning Methody." "Never do you bother yourself about me, Ben. I'm not a-going to turn Methodist any more nor you are, though it's like enough you'll turn to something worse. Mester Irwin's got more sense nor to meddle wi' people's doing as they like in religion. That's between themselves and God, as he says to me many a time." "Aye, aye, but he's none so fond o' your dissenters for all that. Maybe I'm none so fond o' Josh Todd's thick ale, but I don't hinder you from making a fool o' yourself wi't." There was a laugh at this thrust of Adam's, but Seth said very seriously, "Nay, nay, Addy, thee mustna say as anybody's religion's like thick ale. Thee dostna believe but what the dissenters and the Methodists have got the root of the matter as well as the church folks." "Nay, Seth, lad, I'm not for laughing at no man's religion. Let 'em follow their consciences, that's all. Only I think it'd be better if their consciences 'ud let 'em stay quiet i' the church. There's a deal to be learnt there. And there's such a thing as being over-spiritual. We must have something besides gospel o' this world. Look at the canals, and the aqueducts, and the coal-pit engines, and Arkwright's mills there at Cromford. A man must learn summat beside gospel to make them things, I reckon. But to hear some o' them preachers, you'd think as a man must be doing nothing all's life but shutting's eyes and looking what's a-going on inside him. I know a man must have the love o' God in his soul, and the Bible's God's word. But what does the Bible say? Why, it says as God put his sperrit into the workman as built the tabernacle, to make him do all the carved work and things as wanted a nice hand. And this is my way o' looking at it. There's the sperrit o' God in all things and all times, weekday as well as Sunday, and i' the great works and inventions, and i' the figuring and the mechanics. And God helps us with our headpieces and our hands as well as with our souls. And if a man does bits o' jobs out o' working hours, builds a oven for his wife to save her from going to the bakehouse, or scrats at his bit o' garden and makes 2 potatoes grow instead o' 1, he's doing more good, and he's just as near to God as if he was running after some preacher and a-praying and a-groaning." "Well done, Adam," said Sandy Jim, who had paused from his planing to shift his planks while Adam was speaking. "That's the best sarmint I've heard this long while. By the same token, my wife's been a plaguing on me to build her a oven this 12-month." "There's reason in what thee say'st, Adam," observed Seth gravely. "But thee know'st thyself as it's hearing the preachers thee find'st so much fault with has turned many an idle man into an industrious un. It's the preacher as empties the ale-house, and if a man gets religion, he'll do his work none the worse for that." "Only he'll have the panels out of the doors sometimes, eh, Seth?" said wiry Ben. "Ah, Ben, you've got a joke again me as'll last you your life. But it isna religion as was i' fault there. It was Seth Bede, as was allus a wool-gathering chap, and religion hasna cured him, the more's the pity." "Ne'er heed me, Seth," said wiry Ben. "Y'are a downright good-hearted chap, panels or no panels, and ye dinna set up your bristles at every bit of fun, like some of your kin, as is mayhap cliverer." "Seth, lad," said Adam, taking no notice of the sarcasm against himself, "thee mustna take me unkind. I wasna driving at thee in what I said just now. Some has got one way o' looking at things, and some has got another." "Nay, nay, Addy, thee mean'st me no unkindness," said Seth. "I know that well enough. Thee't like thy dog, Gyp. Thee bark'st at me sometimes, but thee allays lick'st my hand after." All hands worked on in silence for some minutes, until the church clock began to strike 6. Before the first stroke had died away, Sandy Jim had loosed his plane and was reaching his jacket. Wiry Ben had left a screw half driven in and thrown his screwdriver into his tool basket. Mum Taft, who, true to his name, had kept silence throughout the previous conversation, had flung down his hammer as he was in the act of lifting it, and Seth too had straightened his back and was putting out his hand towards his paper cap. Adam alone had gone on with his work as if nothing had happened. But observing the cessation of the tools, he looked up and said in a tone of indignation, "Look there now! I can't abide to see men throw away their tools that way, the minute the clock begins to strike, as if they took no pleasure i' their work, and was afraid o' doing a stroke too much." Seth looked a little conscious, and began to be slower in his preparations for going, but Mum Taft broke silence and said, "Aye, aye, Adam lad, ye talk like a young un. When ye are 46 like me, i'stid o' 26, ye wunna be so flush a working for nought." "Nonsense," said Adam, still wrathful. "What's age got to do with it, I wonder? Y' aren't getting stiff yet, I reckon. I hate to see a man's arms drop down as if he was shot before the clock's fairly struck, just as if he'd never a bit of pride and delight in's work. The very grindstone'll go on turning a bit after you loose it." "Botheration, Adam!" exclaimed wiry Ben. "Lave a chap alone, will 'ee? Ye were a finding faut wi' preachers a while ago. Ye're fond enough o' preaching yoursen. Ye may like work better nor play, but I like play better nor work. That'll 'commodate ye. It laves ye the more to do." "Shalt go home before thee goest to the preaching?" Adam asked, looking up. "Nay, I've got my hat and things at Will Maskery's. I shan't be home before going for 10. I'll happen see Dinah Morris safe home, if she's willing. There's nobody comes with her from Poyser's, thee knowest." "Then I'll tell mother not to look for thee," said Adam. "Thee artna going to Poyser's thyself tonight?" said Seth, rather timidly, as he turned to leave the workshop. "Nay, I'm going to the school." Hitherto Gyp had kept his comfortable bed, only lifting up his head and watching Adam more closely as he noticed the other workmen departing. But no sooner did Adam put his ruler in his pocket and begin to twist his apron round his waist, than Gyp ran forward and looked up in his master's face with patient expectation. If Gyp had had a tail, he would doubtless have wagged it, but being destitute of that vehicle for his emotions, he was, like many other worthy personages, destined to appear more phlegmatic than nature had made him. "What? Art ready for the basket, eh, Gyp?" said Adam, with the same gentle modulation of voice as when he spoke to Seth. Gyp jumped and gave a short bark, as much as to say, "Of course." Poor fellow, he had not a great range of expression. The basket was the one which on workdays held Adam's and Seth's dinner, and no official, walking in procession, could look more resolutely unconscious of all acquaintances than Gyp with his basket, trotting at his master's heels. On leaving the workshop, Adam locked the door, took the key out, and carried it to the house on the other side of the woodyard. It was a low house with smooth grey thatch and buff walls, looking pleasant and mellow in the evening light. The leaded windows were bright and speckless, and the stone door was as clean as a white boulder at ebb tide. On the doorstone stood a clean old woman in a dark-striped linen gown, a red kerchief, and a linen cap, talking to some speckled fowls which appeared to have been drawn towards her by an illusory expectation of cold potatoes or barley. The old woman's sight seemed to be dim, for she did not recognize Adam till he said, "Here's the key, Dolly. Lay it down for me in the house, will you?" "Aye, sure, but winna ye come in, Adam? Miss Mary's i' the house, and Mester Burge'll be back anon. He'd be glad to ha' ye to supper wi'm, I'll be his warrand." "No, Dolly, thank you. I'm off home. Good evening." Adam hastened along with long strides, Gyp close to his heels, out of the workyard and along the high road leading away from the village and down to the valley. As he reached the foot of the slope, an elderly horseman with his portmanteau strapped behind him stopped his horse when Adam had passed him, and turned round to have another long look at the stalwart workman in paper cap, leather breeches, and dark blue worsted stockings. Adam, unconscious of the admiration he was exciting, presently struck across the fields, and now broke out into the tune which had all day long been running in his head. "Let all thy converse be sincere, thy conscience as the noonday clear, for God's all-seeing eye surveys thy secret thoughts, thy works and ways." End of chapter 1.
Part 3, Chapter 1 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 1. Soames in Paris. Soames had travelled little. Aged 19, he had made the Petit tour with his father, mother, and Winifred, Brussels, the Rhine, Switzerland, and home by way of Paris. Aged 27, just when he began to take an interest in pictures, he had spent 5 hot weeks in Italy, looking into the Renaissance, not so much in it as he had been led to expect, and a fortnight in Paris on his way back, looking into himself, as became a Forsyte surrounded by people so strongly self-centred and foreign as the French. His knowledge of their language being derived from his public school, he did not understand them when they spoke. Silence he had found better for all parties. One did not make a fool of oneself. He had disliked the look of the men's clothes, the closed-in cabs, the theatres which looked like beehives, the galleries which smelt of beeswax. He was too cautious and too shy to explore that side of Paris supposed by Forsytes to constitute its attraction under the rose. And as for a collector's bargain, not one to be had. As Nicholas might have put it, they were a grasping lot. He had come back uneasy, saying Paris was overrated. When, therefore, in June of 1900 he went to Paris, it was but his third attempt on the centre of civilization. This time, however, the mountain was going to Mahomet, for he felt by now more deeply civilized than Paris, and perhaps he really was. Moreover, he had a definite objective. This was no mere genuflection to a shrine of taste and immorality, but the prosecution of his own legitimate affairs. He went, indeed, because things were getting past a joke. The watch went on, and nothing. Jolyon had never returned to Paris, and no one else was suspect. Busy with new and very confidential matters, Soames was realizing more than ever how essential reputation is to a solicitor. But at night and in his leisure moments he was ravaged by the thought that time was always flying and money flowing in, and his own future as much in irons as ever. Since Mafeking night he had become aware that a young fool of a doctor was hanging round Annette. Twice he had come across him, a cheerful young fool, not more than 30. Nothing annoyed Soames so much as cheerfulness, an indecent, extravagant sort of quality which had no relation to facts. The mixture of his desires and hopes was, in a word, becoming torture, and lately the thought had come to him that perhaps Irene knew she was being shadowed. It was this which finally decided him to go and see for himself, to go and once more try to break down her repugnance, her refusal to make her own and his path comparatively smooth once more. If he failed again, well, he would see what she did with herself anyway. He went to an hotel in the Rue Caumartin, highly recommended to Forsytes, where practically nobody spoke French. He had formed no plan, he did not want to startle her, yet must contrive that she had no chance to evade him by flight. And next morning he set out in bright weather. Paris had an air of gaiety, a sparkle over its star shape, which almost annoyed Soames. He stepped gravely, his nose lifted a little sideways in real curiosity. He desired now to understand things French. Was not Annette French? There was much to be got out of his visit, if he could only get it. In this laudable mood and the Place de la Concorde he was nearly run down 3 times. He came on the Cours la Reine, where Irene's hotel was situated, almost too suddenly, for he had not yet fixed on his procedure. Crossing over to the riverside, he noted the building, white and cheerful-looking, with green sun-blinds, seen through a screen of plane-tree leaves, and, conscious that it would be far better to meet her casually in some open place than to risk a call, he sat down on a bench, whence he could watch the entrance. It was not quite 11 o'clock, and improbable that she had yet gone out. Some pigeons were strutting and preening their feathers in the pools of sunlight between the shadows of the plane trees. A workman in a blue blouse passed, and threw them crumbs from the paper which contained his dinner. A bonne, coiffed with ribbon, shepherded 2 little girls with pigtails and frilled drawers. A cab meandered by, whose cocher wore a blue coat and a black glazed hat. To Soames a kind of affectation seemed to cling about it all, a sort of picturesqueness which was out of date. A theatrical people, the French. He lit one of his rare cigarettes, with a sense of injury that fate should be casting his life into outlandish waters. He shouldn't wonder if Irene quite enjoyed this foreign life. She had never been properly English, even to look at. And he began considering which of those windows could be hers under the green sun-blinds. How could he word what he had come to say, so that it might pierce the defence of her proud obstinacy? He threw the fag end of his cigarette at a pigeon, with the thought, "I can't stay here for ever twiddling my thumbs. Better give it up and call on her in the late afternoon." But he still sat on, heard 12 strike, and then 1:30. "I'll wait till 1, he thought, while I'm about it." But just then he started up, and shrinkingly sat down again. A woman had come out in a cream-coloured frock and was moving away under a fawn-covered parasol. Irene herself. He waited till she was too far away to recognise him, then set out after her. She was strolling as though she had no particular objective, moving, if he remembered rightly, towards the Bois de Boulogne. For half an hour at least he kept his distance on the far side of the way, till she had passed into the Bois itself. Was she going to meet someone after all? Some confounded Frenchman? One of those bel ami chaps, perhaps, who had nothing to do but hang about women? For he had read that book with difficulty and a sort of disgusted fascination. He followed doggedly along a shady alley, losing sight of her now and then when the path curved. And it came back to him how, long ago, one night in Hyde Park, he had slid and sneaked from tree to tree, from seat to seat, hunting blindly, ridiculously, in burning jealousy for her and young Bosinney. The path bent sharply, and hurrying, he came on her sitting in front of a small fountain. a little green-bronze Niobe, veiled in hair to her slender hips, gazing at the pool she had wept. He came on her so suddenly that he was past before he could turn and take off his hat. She did not start up. She had always had great self-command. It was one of the things he most admired in her, one of his greatest grievances against her, because he had never been able to tell what she was thinking. Had she realized that he was following? Her self-possession made him angry, and disdaining to explain his presence, he pointed to the mournful little Niobe and said, "That's rather a good thing." He could see then that she was struggling to preserve her composure. "I didn't want to startle you. Is this one of your haunts?" "Yes." "A little lonely?" As he spoke, a lady strolling by paused to look at the fountain and passed on. Irene's eyes followed her. "No," she said, prodding the ground with her parasol. "Never lonely. One has always one's shadow." Soames understood, and looking at her hard, he exclaimed, "Well, it's your own fault. You can be free of it at any moment. Irene, come back to me and be free." Irene laughed. "Don't!" cried Soames, stamping his foot. "It's inhuman. Listen, is there any condition I can make which will bring you back to me? If I promise you a separate house and just a visit now and then?" Irene rose, something wild suddenly in her face and figure. "None, none, none! You may hunt me to the grave. I will not come." Outraged and on edge, Soames recoiled. "Don't make a scene," he said sharply, and they both stood motionless, staring at the little Niobe, whose greenish flesh the sunlight was burnishing. "That's your last word, then," muttered Soames, clenching his hands. "You condemn us both." Irene bent her head. "I can't come back. Goodbye." A feeling of monstrous injustice flared up in Soames. "Stop," he said, "and listen to me a moment. You gave me a sacred vow. You came to me without a penny. You had all I could give. You broke that vow without cause. You made me a byword. You refused me a child. You've left me in prison. You still move me so that I want you. I want you. Well, what do you think of yourself?" Irene turned. Her face was deadly pale, her eyes burning dark. "God made me as I am," she said, "wicked if you like, but not so wicked that I'll give myself again to a man I hate." The sunlight gleamed on her hair as she moved away, and seemed to lay a caress all down her clinging cream-coloured frock. Soames could neither speak nor move. That word, hate, so extreme, so primitive, made all the Forsyte in him tremble. With a deep imprecation he strode away from where she had vanished, and ran almost into the arms of the lady sauntering back. The fool, the shadowing fool! He was soon dripping with perspiration in the depths of the Bois. "Well," he thought, "I need have no consideration for her now. She hasn't got a grain of it for me. I'll show her this very day that she's my wife still." But on the way back to his hotel he was forced to the conclusion that he did not know what he meant. One could not make scenes in public, and short of scenes in public, what was there he could do? He almost cursed his own thin-skinnedness. She might deserve no consideration, but he, alas, deserved some at his own hands. And sitting lunchless in the hall of his hotel, with tourists passing every moment, Baedeker in hand, he was visited by black dejection. In irons. His whole life, with every natural instinct and every decent yearning gagged and fettered, and all because fate had driven him 17 years ago to set his heart upon this woman, so utterly that even now he had no real heart to set on any other. Cursed was the day he had met her, and his eyes for seeing in her anything but the cruel Venus she was. And yet, still seeing her with the sunlight on the clinging china crepe of her gown, he uttered a little groan, so that a tourist who was passing thought, "Man in pain. Let's see, what did I have for lunch?" Later, in front of a café near the opera, over a glass of cold tea with lemon and a straw in it, he took the malicious resolution to go and dine at her hotel. If she were there he would speak to her. If she were not, he would leave a note. He dressed carefully and wrote as follows: "Your idyll with that fellow Jolyon Forsyte is known to me at all events. If you pursue it, understand that I will leave no stone unturned to make things unbearable for him. S.F." He sealed this note, but did not address it, refusing to write the maiden name which she had impudently resumed, or to put the word Forsyte on the envelope, lest she should tear it up unread. Then he went out and made his way through the glowing streets, abandoned to evening pleasure-seekers. Entering her hotel, he took his seat in a far corner of the dining-room, whence he could see all entrances and exits. She was not there. He ate little, quickly, watchfully. She did not come. He lingered in the lounge over his coffee, drank 2 liqueurs of brandy, but still she did not come. He went over to the keyboard and examined the names. Number 12 on the first floor, and he determined to take the note up himself. He mounted red-carpeted stairs, past a little salon. 8, 10, 12. Should he knock, push the note under, or... He looked furtively round and turned the handle. The door opened, but into a little space leading to another door. He knocked on that. No answer. The door was locked. It fitted very closely to the floor. The note would not go under. He thrust it back into his pocket and stood a moment listening. He felt somehow certain that she was not there. And suddenly he came away, passing the little salon down the stairs. He stopped at the bureau and said, "Will you kindly see that Mrs. Heron has this note?" "Madame Heron left today, monsieur, suddenly, about 3 o'clock. There was illness in her family." Soames compressed his lips. "Oh," he said. "Do you know her address?" "No, monsieur. England, I think." Soames put the note back into his pocket and went out. He hailed an open horse-cab which was passing. "Drive me anywhere." The man, who obviously did not understand, smiled and waved his whip, and Soames was borne along in that little yellow-wheeled Victoria, all over star-shaped Paris, with here and there a pause, and the question, "C'est par ici, monsieur?" "No, go on," till the man gave it up in despair, and the yellow-wheeled chariot continued to roll between the tall, flat-fronted, shuttered houses and plane-tree avenues, a little Flying Dutchman of a cab. Like my life, thought Soames, without object, on and on. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.
Chapter 25 of Anne of Green Gables. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, June 2007. Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. Matthew insists on puffed sleeves. Matthew was having a bad 10 minutes of it. He had come into the kitchen in the twilight of a cold, grey December evening, and had sat down in the woodbox corner to take off his heavy boots, unconscious of the fact that Anne and a bevy of her schoolmates were having a practice of the Fairy Queen in the sitting-room. Presently they came trooping through the hall and out into the kitchen, laughing and chattering gaily. They did not see Matthew, who shrank bashfully back into the shadows beyond the woodbox, with a boot in one hand and a boot-jack in the other, and watched them shyly for the aforesaid 10 minutes as they put on caps and jackets and talked about the dialogue and the concert. Anne stood among them, bright-eyed and animated as they, but Matthew suddenly became conscious that there was something about her different from her mates. And what worried Matthew was that the difference impressed him as being something that should not exist. Anne had a brighter face and bigger, starrier eyes and more delicate features than the others. Even shy, unobservant Matthew had learned to take note of these things. But the difference that disturbed him did not consist in any of these respects. Then in what did it consist? Matthew was haunted by this question long after the girls had gone, arm in arm, down the long, hard-frozen lane, and Anne had betaken herself to her books. He could not refer it to Marilla, who, he felt, would be quite sure to sniff scornfully and remark that the only difference she saw between Anne and the other girls was that they sometimes kept their tongues quiet, while Anne never did. This, Matthew felt, would be no great help. He had recourse to his pipe that evening to help him study it out, much to Marilla's disgust. After 2 hours of smoking and hard reflection, Matthew arrived at a solution of his problem. Anne was not dressed like the other girls. The more Matthew thought about the matter, the more he was convinced that Anne never had been dressed like the other girls, never since she came to Green Gables. Marilla kept her clothed in plain, dark dresses, all made after the same unvarying pattern. If Matthew knew there was such a thing as fashion in dress, it was as much as he did, but he was quite sure that Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves the other girls wore. He recalled the cluster of little girls he had seen around her that evening, all gay in waists of red and blue and pink and white, and he wondered why Marilla always kept her so plainly and soberly gowned. Of course it must be all right. Marilla knew best, and Marilla was bringing her up. Probably some wise, inscrutable motive was to be served thereby. But surely it would do no harm to let the child have one pretty dress, something like Diana Barry always wore. Matthew decided that he would give her one. That surely could not be objected to as an unwarranted putting in of his oar. Christmas was only a fortnight off. A nice new dress would be the very thing for a present. Matthew, with a sigh of satisfaction, put away his pipe and went to bed, while Marilla opened all the doors and aired the house. The very next evening Matthew betook himself to Carmody to buy the dress, determined to get the worst over and have done with it. It would be, he felt assured, no trifling ordeal. There were some things Matthew could buy and prove himself no mean bargainer, but he knew he would be at the mercy of shopkeepers when it came to buying a girl's dress. After much cogitation, Matthew resolved to go to Samuel Lawson's store instead of William Blair's. To be sure, the Cuthberts always had gone to William Blair's. It was almost as much a matter of conscience with them as to attend the Presbyterian church and vote Conservative. But William Blair's 2 daughters frequently waited on customers there, and Matthew held them in absolute dread. He could contrive to deal with them when he knew exactly what he wanted and could point it out, but in such a matter as this, requiring explanation and consultation, Matthew felt that he must be sure of a man behind the counter. So he would go to Lawson's, where Samuel or his son would wait on him. Alas, Matthew did not know that Samuel, in the recent expansion of his business, had set up a lady clerk also. She was a niece of his wife's, and a very dashing young person indeed, with a huge drooping pompadour, big rolling brown eyes, and a most extensive and bewildering smile. She was dressed with exceeding smartness, and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and rattled and tinkled with every movement of her hands. Matthew was covered with confusion at finding her there at all, and those bangles completely wrecked his wits at one fell swoop. "What can I do for you this evening, Mr. Cuthbert?" Miss Lucilla Harris inquired, briskly and ingratiatingly, tapping the counter with both hands. "Have you any, well now, say, any garden rakes?" stammered Matthew. Miss Harris looked somewhat surprised, as well she might, to hear a man inquiring for garden rakes in the middle of December. "I believe we have 1 or 2 left over," she said, "but they're upstairs in the lumber room. I'll go and see." During her absence, Matthew collected his scattered senses for another effort. When Miss Harris returned with the rake and cheerfully inquired, "Anything else tonight, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew took his courage in both hands and replied, "Well now, since you suggest it, I might as well buy some hayseed." Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. She now concluded that he was entirely crazy. "We only keep hayseed in the spring," she explained loftily. "We've none on hand just now." "Oh, certainly, just as you say," stammered unhappy Matthew, seizing the rake and making for the door. At the threshold he recollected that he had not paid for it, and he turned miserably back. While Miss Harris was counting out his change, he rallied his powers for a final, desperate attempt. "Well now, if it isn't too much trouble, I might as well, I'd like to look at some sugar." "White or brown?" queried Miss Harris patiently. "Oh, well now, brown," said Matthew feebly. "There's a barrel of it over there," said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. "It's the only kind we have." I'll take 20 pounds of it," said Matthew, with beads of perspiration standing on his forehead. Matthew had driven halfway home before he was his own man again. It had been a gruesome experience, but it served him right, he thought, for committing the heresy of going to a strange store. When he reached home he hid the rake in the tool house, but the sugar he carried in to Marilla. "Brown sugar!" exclaimed Marilla. "Whatever possessed you to get so much? You know I never use it except for the hired man's porridge or black fruit cake. Jerry's gone, and I've made my cake long ago. It's not good sugar either. It's coarse and dark. William Blair doesn't usually keep sugar like that." I thought it might come in handy sometime," said Matthew, making good his escape. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. Marilla was out of the question. Matthew felt sure she would throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde, for of no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hands. "Pick out a dress for you to give Anne? To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow, and I'll attend to it. Have you something particular in mind? No? Well, I'll just go by my own judgment then. I believe a nice rich brown would just suit Anne, and William Blair has some new Gloria in that's real pretty. Perhaps you'd like me to make it up for her, too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before the time and spoil the surprise? Well, I'll do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing. I'll make it to fit my niece, Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure goes." "Well now, I'm much obliged," said Matthew, and I don't know, but I think they make the sleeves different nowadays to what they used to be. If it wouldn't be asking too much, I'd like them made in the new way." "Puffs? Of course. You needn't worry a speck more about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion," said Mrs. Lynde. To herself she added when Matthew had gone, "It'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor child wearing something decent for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous, that's what, and I've ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice, and she thinks she knows more about bringing up children than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way. Folks that has brought up children know there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. But them as never have think it's all plain and easy as rule of 3. Just set your 3 terms down so fashion, and the sum'll work out correct. But flesh and blood don't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes her mistake. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility in Anne by dressing her as she does, but it's more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls. But to think of Matthew taking notice of it! That man is waking up after being asleep for over 60 years. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess until Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it is very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. "So this is what Matthew has been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it?" she said, a little stiffly but tolerantly. "I knew he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything more is sheer extravagance. There's enough material in those sleeves alone to make a waist, I declare there is. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she's as vain as a peacock now. Well, I hope she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after those silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she never said a word after the first. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. They're as big as balloons now. Next year anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways." Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December, and people had looked forward to a green Christmas, but just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. "Merry Christmas, Marilla! Merry Christmas, Matthew! Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? I don't like green Christmases. They're not green. They're just nasty faded browns and grays. What makes people call them green? Why, Matthew, is that for me? Oh, Matthew!" Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A lovely soft brown gloria with all the gloss of silk, a skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves, they were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them 2 beautiful puffs, divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. "That's a Christmas present for you, Anne," said Matthew shyly. Why, Anne, don't you like it?" Well now, well now." For Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. "Like it? Oh, Matthew!" Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. "Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream." "Well, well, let's have breakfast," interrupted Marilla. "I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in." "I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast," said Anne rapturously. "Breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting time. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puffed sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in future. But somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this." When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. "Merry Christmas, Diana! And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas! I've something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress, with such sleeves! I couldn't even imagine any nicer." "I've got something more for you," said Diana breathlessly. "Here, this box. Aunt Josephine sent us out a big box with ever so many things in it, and this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come until after dark, and I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now." Anne opened the box and peeped in. First a card with "For the Anne girl and Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. "Oh," said Anne, "Diana, this is too much. I must be dreaming." "I call it providential," said Diana. "You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they're 2 sizes too big for you, and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. Josie Pye would be delighted. Mind you, Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from the practice night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that?" All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was a pronounced success. The little hall was crowded, all the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the bright particular star of the occasion, as even envy in the shape of Josie Pye dared not deny. "Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening?" sighed Anne when it was all over, and she and Diana were walking home together under a dark, starry sky. "Everything went off very well," said Diana practically. "I guess we must have made as much as $10. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it to the Charlottetown papers." "Oh, Diana, will we really see our names in print? It makes me thrill to think of it. Your solo was perfectly elegant, Diana. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, it is my dear bosom friend who is so honored. Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid. Oh, I was so nervous, Diana. When Mr. Allen called out my name, I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking at me and through me. And for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all. Then I thought of my lovely puffed sleeves and took courage. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Diana. So I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I just felt like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced those recitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never have been able to get through. Did I groan all right?" "Yes, indeed, you groaned lovely," assured Diana. "I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I had touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed." "Wasn't the boys' dialogue fine?" said Diana. "Gilbert Blythe was just splendid. Anne, I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. There now. You're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased at that." "It's nothing to me what that person does," said Anne loftily. "I simply never waste a thought on him, Diana." That night Marilla and Matthew, who had been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat for a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. "Well now, I guess our Anne did as well as any of them," said Matthew proudly. "Yes, she did," admitted Marilla. "She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice, too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, although I'm not going to tell her so." "Well now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her so 'fore she went upstairs," said Matthew. "We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea school by and by." "There's time enough to think of that," said Marilla. "She's only 13 in March. Though tonight it struck me she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's after a spell. But nothing need be said about that for a year or two yet." "Well now, it'll do no harm to be thinking it over off and on," said Matthew. "Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over." End of chapter 25.